Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I'm not sure what time it was when I first woke up. The cabin was pitch black and dead silent. At first I thought maybe I just had to pee, but then I heard it. This bizarre shrieking sound echoing through the woods. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. The closest thing I could compare it to was maybe a gibbon's call, but much louder and more guttural. I lay there frozen, straining my ears. After a few seconds of silence, it came again. 3 distinct shrieks in quick succession. My heart started racing. It sounded like it was coming from maybe a quarter-mile away. I told myself it was probably just some kind of bird or something, trying to calm myself down. But then I heard it again, and it was definitely closer this time. I sat up in my cot, fumbling for the flashlight I'd left by my pillow. My hands were shaking as I clicked it on. The beam of light revealed Tom still fast asleep in the other cot. I hissed his name, wanting to wake him up, but not wanting to make too much noise. Before I could reach over to shake him awake, another series of shrieks pierced the night. It sounded like it was just outside the cabin now. I broke out in a cold sweat, my whole body trembling. This was no bird. The shrieks were deep and powerful, almost primal. They didn't sound like they were coming from any animal I knew of. I shook Tom's shoulder urgently. "Tom, wake up, man, do you hear that?" I whispered frantically. He just groaned and rolled over. How could he sleep through this? The shrieks came again, definitely right outside now. It sounded like whatever was making them was circling the cabin. I could hear heavy footsteps crunching in the leaves and underbrush. My chest felt tight, like I could barely breathe. I was too terrified to move. Suddenly there was a loud thump against the side of the cabin, like something massive had slammed into it. The whole structure shook. I let out an involuntary yelp, and Tom finally jolted awake. "What the hell was that?" he mumbled groggily. "There's something out there," I hissed. "Listen." We sat in tense silence for a few moments. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then the shrieks started up again, but they sounded like they were moving away now. Tom rubbed his eyes, looking confused. "I don't hear anything, man. You sure you weren't dreaming?" I gaped at him in disbelief. "Are you kidding me? How could you not hear that? It was so loud." He just shrugged. "Sorry, dude. I didn't hear a thing. Go back to sleep. You probably just had a nightmare or something." But I knew it wasn't a nightmare. I'd been wide awake. I sat there clutching my flashlight for the rest of the night, jumping at every little sound. As the sky started to lighten with the approaching dawn, I finally dozed off for an hour or two. When we got up the next morning, I immediately went outside to look for tracks or some kind of evidence. But I couldn't find anything definitive, just some trampled vegetation that could have been from anything. Tom clearly thought I was losing it. He kept cracking jokes about Bigfoot the whole drive home. I tried to put the incident out of my mind over the years. I told myself maybe it really had just been a vivid dream. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard was real. Then, about 5 years ago, I was flipping channels late one night and came across this documentary about unexplained phenomena. They were talking about various Bigfoot encounters, playing audio clips of alleged Sasquatch calls. When they played one particular recording, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. It was exactly, and I mean exactly, like what I'd heard that night in Maryland. The same eerie, guttural shrieks in sets of 3 or 4. I just sat there in shock, goosebumps rising on my arms. All the terror from that night came flooding back. I knew then that what I'd experienced was real. Something had been out there in those woods, something that wasn't supposed to exist. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I've never been back to that state park. Just thinking about camping in the woods makes me break out in a cold sweat now. I don't know if it was actually a Sasquatch or what. But I know something was out there that night. Something big and powerful and not of this world. The sound of those shrieks still haunts my dreams sometimes. I've tried researching other reports from that area, but haven't found much. Part of me wants answers, but another part is scared to dig too deep. What if whatever it was is still out there? What if it's not the only one? I've never told many people about this. Even now, typing it out, I feel silly. But I know what I experienced. Those sounds, that presence. It was unlike anything else. Sometimes I wonder if I should try to go back, to see if I can find any clues. But then I remember the sheer terror of that night, and I know I never want to feel that again. So I'm left with this bizarre, inexplicable experience that I can't fully process. It's like this splinter in my mind that I can't quite get out. I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I know that night changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Things that lurk in the shadows, just out of sight. I still love nature and the outdoors, but I'll never look at a dense forest the same way again. There's always that little voice in the back of my head now, wondering what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. Wondering if I'll ever hear those chilling shrieks again. Sometimes I think about contacting researchers or going public with my story, but then I worry about being labeled a kook or a liar. And honestly, part of me doesn't want to know the truth. What if finding out would somehow make it worse? So I've kept it mostly to myself all these years. I'm not sure why I'm finally sharing this now. Maybe just to get it off my chest. Maybe in hopes that someone out there has had a similar experience and can relate. Or maybe as a warning to others, there are things out there we don't understand. Be careful in the wilderness. You never know what might be lurking just out of sight. Whatever it was I encountered that night, it left an indelible mark on me. The memory is as vivid now as it was 35 years ago. Those shrieks, that sense of an immense presence just outside, I'll never forget it as long as I live. It was terrifying, yes, but also awe-inspiring in a way. A reminder that the world is vaster and stranger than we can imagine. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, I know how it sounds, but I know what I experienced. And I know that somewhere out there, in the forests of Maryland, there's something that isn't supposed to exist, something that defies explanation. And on quiet nights, I still sometimes imagine I can hear those chilling shrieks echoing in the distance. Story 2. Suddenly, I felt an eerie prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the feeling intensified, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Slowly, I raised my eyes to look out the window above the kitchen sink. What I saw in that moment will haunt me for the rest of my days. There, pressed against the glass, was an enormous, hairy face staring right at me. Its eyes were dark and intelligent, glinting in the dim light from the kitchen. The creature's features were distinctly ape-like, yet eerily human at the same time. Its massive head must have been twice the size of a normal person's. I froze in terror, unable to move or even breathe. Time seemed to stand still as I locked eyes with this impossible being. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, survival instinct kicked in. I dropped the plate I was holding with a crash and ran from the kitchen, screaming. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. I babbled hysterically to the operator, trying to explain what I'd seen. She kept asking me to slow down and repeat myself. Looking back, I'm sure she thought I was some lunatic having a mental breakdown. But she must have sensed my genuine fear, because she assured me officers were on their way. I paced anxiously as I waited for the police to arrive, jumping at every little sound. Part of me was terrified the creature would break in, while another part desperately hoped I had imagined the whole thing. When I heard sirens approaching, I nearly cried with relief. The officers who responded were clearly skeptical at first. I could tell from their expressions they thought this was going to be a false alarm or a case of an overactive imagination. But as I described what I'd seen in detail, the massive size, the inhuman yet intelligent eyes, the thick fur covering its face, I saw doubt creep into their eyes. They searched around the outside of the house, shining flashlights into the darkness. I held my breath as one of them approached the kitchen window. "Ma'am," he called out, "you're gonna want to see this." With shaking legs, I made my way over. There, clearly visible in the beam of the flashlight, were several long, coarse hairs stuck to the outside of the window. My knees went weak as the reality of what I'd seen came crashing down on me. This wasn't my imagination. Something had been there. Things escalated quickly after that. More police cars arrived, and they began organizing a search of the surrounding area. I overheard snatches of radio chatter as they coordinated. Words like large bipedal creature and possible Bigfoot sighting made my head spin. I sat wrapped in a blanket on my front porch, giving my statement over and over to different officers. My eyes kept darting to the tree line, half expecting to see that terrifying face emerge from the shadows at any moment. Sometime around midnight, the radio crackled to life with an urgent message. One of the officers on patrol had spotted something on the highway, a huge, man-like figure running at incredible speed. The officer gave chase in his cruiser, but whatever it was disappeared into the woods before he could catch up. This sent the search into overdrive. More units were called in, including a K-9 team. They scoured the area where the creature was last seen, and that's when they found the tracks. Enormous footprints, far larger than any human foot, pressed deep into the soft earth. The stride length between prints was massive, indicating whatever made them was capable of covering huge distances quickly. I'll never forget the look on the face of the veteran officer who came to show me photos of the prints. This tough, no-nonsense cop looked genuinely shaken. "In all my years on the force," he told me, "I've never seen anything like this." As dawn broke, the initial search was called off. But this was far from over. News of the sighting spread like wildfire. Within days, our quiet community was overrun with reporters, paranormal researchers, and curiosity seekers. I barely slept, plagued by nightmares of that hairy face pressed against my window. A few days later, an investigator from Colorado arrived to examine the footprints. He was some kind of expert in cryptozoology and Bigfoot encounters. I was skeptical at first. The whole idea still seemed so impossible. But his analysis was disturbingly convincing. He explained how the depth and distribution of weight in the prints ruled out the possibility of a hoax using fake feet. The creature's gait and stride length were unlike anything seen in known primates. Most chilling of all, he pointed out subtle signs of dermal ridges, essentially fingerprints, in some of the clearer tracks. "Whatever made these prints," he told me gravely, "it was a real, living creature, and it was something science can't yet explain." In the weeks and months that followed, more sightings were reported in the area. Campers described hearing terrifying howls in the night. Hikers found strange structures of broken branches deep in the forest, but nothing as clear or as close as what I experienced that night. It's been years now, and I still struggle to make sense of what happened. Was it truly Bigfoot, or some unknown species of primate? A terrifying mutation or government experiment gone wrong? Or something even stranger that defies explanation? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I know what I saw. That face at my window was real. Those eyes held an intelligence that still chills me to my core. Whatever it was aware. It was watching me. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting, watching. I've tried to move on with my life, But that night changed me forever. I'm more cautious now, always aware of my surroundings. I've developed a deep respect for the mysteries that still exist in this world, and I'll never again assume that the stories and legends we dismiss as impossible are purely fiction, because sometimes the monsters are real, and sometimes they're closer than we ever imagined. Story 3. I'll never forget that day in November 1997. It was the opening weekend of deer hunting season in northern Wisconsin, and I was out in the woods of Price County like I had been every year since I was old enough to hunt. The air was crisp and cold, with a light dusting of snow on the ground, perfect conditions for tracking deer. I had set up my tree stand before dawn and spent the early morning hours silently watching and waiting. As the sun climbed higher, I decided to do some still hunting on foot, moving slowly and quietly through the forest in hopes of spotting a buck. It was around 2 p.m. when things took a turn I never could have expected. I was creeping along the edge of a small ridge, scanning the trees and brush for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it, a large, dark figure moving through the trees about 100 yards away. At first I thought it must be another hunter, but something about the way it moved just seemed off. Its gait was strange, long, loping strides that covered way more ground than a normal person's would, and its arms, they were swinging in this weird, exaggerated motion, coming up almost to head level with each step. I froze in place, my heart starting to race. Whatever this thing was, it definitely wasn't human. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a bulky, muscular frame. The hair covering its body was dark, almost black. I watched in disbelief as it made its way along the ridgeline. Its movements were deliberate but awkward, like its body wasn't quite built for walking upright. Every few steps it would reach out and grab a tree trunk, using it to help propel itself forward. The strangest part was the sound. With each step, I could hear branches and twigs snapping loudly underfoot. But it wasn't the normal, random sounds of something moving through the woods. The break sounded intentional, like it was purposely stepping on branches to make noise. I don't know how long I stood there watching it. Maybe only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. I was paralyzed, too scared to move or make a sound. Part of me wanted to run, but I was afraid any movement would attract its attention. Eventually, it disappeared from view behind some thick brush. I waited several more minutes, straining my ears for any sound of its continued movement. But there was nothing, just an eerie silence that seemed to blanket the whole forest. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I headed straight back to my truck as fast as I could while still trying to stay quiet. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I sped out of there and didn't stop until I reached the small general store about 20 miles away where hunters would gather. I burst in, probably looking wild-eyed and crazy, and started telling anyone who would listen what I had seen. Most of the guys there laughed it off or accused me of hitting the whiskey too early. But there was one older man, a local who had lived in the area his whole life, who took me seriously. He nodded gravely as I described the creature and said, "Yep, sounds like you saw the Bigfoot. He's been spotted round these parts for generations." I peppered the old-timer with questions, desperate for any information or explanation. He told me there had been periodic sightings going back at least to the 1960s, maybe even earlier. Most were just glimpses or strange noises in the night. But a few people claimed to have seen it up close, just like I had. According to him, the creature seemed to roam a territory of several hundred square miles, stretching across parts of Price, Ashland, and Sawyer counties. It was rarely seen in the same place twice. Some thought it might hibernate in winter, which could explain why sightings were most common in spring and fall. I asked if anyone had ever tried to track it or capture evidence. The old man chuckled and said plenty had tried over the years, but the creature was too clever. It seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to vanish without a trace. "That's why they call it Bigfoot," he said. "Big as a bear, but it can disappear like smoke when it wants to." I don't know if I really believe in Bigfoot. Even now, 25 years later, part of me wonders if what I saw that day was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw, and I know the fear I felt was real. I've been back to those woods many times since then. I still hunt there most years. But I've never seen anything like that creature again. Sometimes when I'm out there alone, I'll hear a twig snap or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. And for just a second, that old fear comes rushing back. I've told this story many times over the years. Most people don't believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me. But I know what I experienced that day was real. Something strange is out there in those northern Wisconsin forests. I just hope I never come face to face with it again. The encounter has stayed with me all these years. I find myself constantly wondering about that creature. Where did it come from? How has it managed to stay hidden for so long? Are there more of them out there? I've done a lot of research since then, reading every book and article I could find about Bigfoot sightings. I've even attended a few conferences and meetups for Bigfoot enthusiasts. It's been fascinating to hear other people's stories and theories. One thing that really struck me was how similar many of the sightings are to what I experienced. The height, the strange gait, the swinging arms, these details come up again and again in reports from all over North America. It makes me feel less crazy, knowing others have seen the same thing. I've also learned a lot about the history of Bigfoot sightings in Wisconsin. Turns out the creature I saw might be part of a long tradition. Native American tribes in the region have stories of giant, hairy, wild men going back centuries. The first documented sighting by a white settler was in the 1870s, just a few counties over from where I had my encounter. Some researchers think the creatures might be some kind of undiscovered primate, maybe a relative of extinct apes like Gigantopithecus. Others believe they could be some sort of interdimensional being, able to pop in and out of our reality. Personally, I don't know what to think. I just know what I saw. I've gone back to that exact spot a few times over the years, hoping to see something again. But it's always quiet, just a normal stretch of forest. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the fear I felt, the way my heart raced, the vivid details of the creature's movement. It was real. I'm sure of it. I've never told many people outside my close friends and family about what happened. For years I was afraid people would think I was crazy or making it up for attention. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that it doesn't really matter what others think. I know what I saw, and sharing my story might help others who've had similar experiences feel less alone. That's why I'm writing this now. If you're reading this and you've seen something you can't explain, know that you're not alone. There are strange things in this world that we may never fully understand. All we can do is keep our eyes open and our minds ready for the unexpected. I still go hunting in those woods every year, and every time there's a part of me that hopes and fears that I'll see that creature again. So far, it hasn't happened, but who knows? Maybe someday I'll have another encounter, and if I do, you can bet I'll be sharing that story too. Until then, I'll keep watching the woods, listening for that telltale snap of branches. Because now I know there's more out there than meets the eye. And sometimes the legends we dismiss as mere stories turn out to be all too real. Story 4. The bridge had a reputation for being haunted. People claimed to hear weird noises and see strange lights there at night. Of course, Jake and I thought we were too cool to actually believe any of that nonsense. We just wanted to prove how brave we were by spending a night out there. It was chilly for September, and a light fog was rolling in off the bay as we parked Jake's beaten-up Chevy Nova at the end of the dirt access road. The bridge loomed ahead of us, looking eerie and abandoned in the moonlight. As we got out of the car, The silence was oppressive. No cars, no distant town noises, just the faint lapping of water against the shore. "Dude, this place is creepy as hell," Jake whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. I tried to act nonchalant, but my heart was already beating faster. "Yeah, good atmosphere for ghost hunting," I joked weakly. We made our way onto the bridge, our footsteps echoing hollowly on the old wooden planks. About halfway across, we stopped to lean against the railing and look out over the dark water. That's when we heard the first noise, a loud crack, like a branch breaking, coming from the woods on the far side of the bridge. Jake and I both jumped, then laughed nervously. "Probably just a deer or something," I said, not quite believing it. We stayed quiet, straining our ears. For a few minutes there was nothing. Then we heard it again. Another crack, closer this time, and another. Something was moving through the underbrush, heading our way. "Maybe we should head back to the car," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, too freaked out to speak. We turned and started walking quickly back the way we came. That's when the screaming started. It was the most horrifying sound I've ever heard in my life. A high-pitched, inhuman shriek that seemed to go on forever. It paralyzed us for a moment, rooting us to the spot. Then we saw it emerge from the tree line. In the dim moonlight, all I could make out at first was that it was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. As it lumbered out onto the bridge, I could see matted, shaggy fur covering its body. It moved in a strange, hunched-over gait, almost like a gorilla. "Run!" Jake yelled, snapping me out of my terrified trance. We took off, sprinting down the bridge. I could hear the creature's heavy footsteps pounding the wooden planks behind us, getting closer with each passing second. Another blood-curdling shriek split the night air. I risked a glance over my shoulder and nearly tripped in shock. The thing had risen up to its full height, running on 2 legs now. In the darkness, I could just make out long arms swinging at its sides and a vaguely human-like face covered in thick hair. Jake and I flew off the end of the bridge, our feet skidding in the loose gravel as we rounded the corner towards where we'd parked. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but sheer terror kept me going. We reached the car, and Jake fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. I kept my eyes locked on the bridge, watching in horror as the creature's massive silhouette appeared, outlined against the night sky. "Hurry up, man!" I screamed, yanking frantically on the passenger door handle. The car door finally unlocked with a click that seemed deafeningly loud in the quiet night. We dove inside, just as another inhuman howl echoed across the water. Jake got the key in the ignition and cranked it. The engine sputtered once, twice. Come on," Jake muttered desperately. I could see the creature loping towards us on all 4s now, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Just as it reached the edge of the small clearing where we were parked, the engine roared to life. Jake slammed it into reverse, tires spitting gravel as we fishtailed backwards down the narrow access road. I twisted around in my seat, heart pounding, fully expecting to see the monster right on our tail. But there was nothing there. Jake got us turned around and we tore out of there, not slowing down until we hit the main highway several miles later. We drove all the way back to town in tense silence, both of us too scared and confused to even begin processing what we'd just experienced. It wasn't until Jake pulled up in front of my house that we finally spoke. What the hell was that thing?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. I shook my head, at a loss for words. "I don't know, man. I really don't know." We agreed to meet up the next day to talk more. I don't think either of us got much sleep that night. I kept replaying the terrifying encounter in my mind, questioning if it had really happened or if it was just some kind of shared hallucination. The next morning, Jake showed up at my door, looking as haggard as I felt. We decided to go back out to the bridge in the daylight, hoping it would somehow make more sense. The drive out there was tense. Neither of us really wanted to go back, but we needed answers. As we pulled up to where we'd parked the night before, my stomach clenched with anxiety. But in the bright morning sunlight, the area looked completely ordinary. Just a typical northern Wisconsin forest scene. We cautiously made our way onto the bridge, alert for any sign of danger. But there was nothing out of the ordinary. No broken branches, no signs of any large animal. We were starting to think we'd imagined the whole thing. That's when Jake spotted something in the dirt near the base of the bridge. "Hey, check this out," he called. I walked over and felt the blood drain from my face. There in the soft earth were a series of enormous footprints, easily twice the size of a normal human foot. They showed a strange, ape-like shape with opposable toes. We followed the tracks to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared into the thick underbrush. Jake and I looked at each other, the realization sinking in that what we'd encountered was very, very real. "Should we tell someone?" Jake asked. "The police or park rangers or something?" I thought about it for a moment. Who would believe us? They'd just think we were pulling some kind of prank. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. Who would believe two teenagers claiming they'd been chased by some kind of giant, bipedal creature in the woods of northern Wisconsin? We'd be laughed out of town, but I've never forgotten that night. The terrifying shrieks, the massive fur-covered shape, those inhuman footprints, it's all seared into my memory. I've done research over the years, read accounts of similar encounters. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what it was, but I know what I saw. I haven't been back to that bridge since that day, and I probably never will. Some things are better left alone, but every time I'm in the woods and hear an unexpected noise, I can't help but tense up, half expecting to hear that bone-chilling scream again. Whatever's out there in those forests, I hope I never encounter it again. Story 5. It was around 11:30 p.m. as I navigated the dark, empty roads. The only sound was my tires on the wet pavement and an old Guns N' Roses cassette playing softly on the stereo. I was tired and ready to get home, my mind wandering as I drove on autopilot through the familiar turns. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and my car lurched violently to the right. I gripped the wheel tight, heart racing as I fought to keep control. I managed to slow down and pull off onto the shoulder, the car listing awkwardly. "Shit," I muttered, realizing I must have blown a tire. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath and debating what to do. I didn't have a cell phone back then, and I knew I was at least 5 miles from the nearest gas station or house. With a sigh, I pulled on my jacket and grabbed the flashlight from the glove box. I'd have to change the tire myself. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I was enveloped by the damp, chilly fog. My breath came out in visible puffs as I shone the flashlight beam along the side of the car. Sure enough, the rear passenger tire was completely flat. I popped the trunk and started digging around for the spare and jack. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the darkness beyond my car. I froze, flashlight beam dancing wildly as my hand shook. "Hello?" I called out tentatively. "Is someone there?" Silence. Just the soft patter of mist collecting on leaves. I tried to laugh it off. Probably just an animal or my imagination getting the best of me. But as I bent down to position the jack, I heard heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush, getting closer. I whirled around, heart pounding. The fog seemed to part like a curtain, and there it was, a massive, hair-covered figure emerging from the mist, not 20 feet away. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was vaguely man-shaped, but huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, broad chest and shoulders covered in long, shaggy brown fur. As my flashlight beam hit its face, I saw glinting eyes and bared teeth in a short, flat muzzle. It let out another rumbling growl that vibrated in my chest, This was no man in a costume. This was something else entirely. For a moment we just stared at each other, frozen. Then it took a lumbering step towards me, and I snapped out of my shock. I scrambled backwards, fumbling with my keys as I lunged for the driver's side door. Just as my hand closed on the handle, I heard the thing break into a run behind me. Adrenaline surging, I yanked the door open and dove inside, slamming it shut. I jammed the key in the ignition with shaking hands and cranked it. The engine sputtered once, twice. "Come on, come on," I pleaded. In the rearview mirror, I could see the creature's massive form charging towards my car. The engine roared to life just as a huge, hairy arm slammed against my window. I screamed and stomped on the gas pedal. The car fishtailed wildly on the gravel shoulder before the tires found purchase. I could hear the thing's claws scraping down the side of the car as I accelerated away. I was hyperventilating, knuckles white on the steering wheel as I pushed the car as fast as it would go on the uneven back road. The flat tire thumped rhythmically, but I didn't dare slow down. In the mirror, I could see the creature loping after me on two legs, moving with unnatural speed. Suddenly, it leapt forward in a massive bound. I felt the whole car shudder as its weight landed on the trunk. Claws scrabbled at the back windshield, and I heard the glass start to crack. Blind panic took over, and I started swerving back and forth across the road, trying to shake it off. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, I felt the car lighten as the creature lost its grip and tumbled off. I kept driving for miles, too terrified to slow down or look back. It wasn't until I reached the highway that I finally eased off the gas, shaking uncontrollably. I drove straight to the sheriff's station, burst through the doors in hysterics, and poured out my story to the bemused deputy on duty. Of course, he assumed I was drunk or on drugs. When I insisted it was real, he humored me and sent a car out to check the area. They found nothing, of course, except some deep scratches on my car that they attributed to tree branches. For years, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination or a vivid dream. But I know what I saw that night. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those gleaming eyes emerging from the fog. I've never driven those back roads on Halloween night again. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I have a hard time believing it myself. But I know what I experienced was real. Whatever that thing was, Bigfoot, a monster, some unknown creature, it was out there in those woods. And who knows, maybe it still is, waiting in the mist for another unsuspecting driver to break down on a lonely road on a dark October night. Story 6. I was just a kid back in '92, barely 12 years old, but that hunting trip with my dad is seared into my memory like it was yesterday. We'd been going to the same spot in Marinette County for years, always during deer season in November. This time, though, everything felt different from the moment we arrived. The air had this eerie stillness to it, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Dad noticed it too. I could see it in the way his eyes darted around, more alert than usual. We set up our blind like always, but something just felt off. That first morning, we headed out before dawn. The mist was thick, clinging to everything. As we slogged through the marshy areas, I noticed there weren't any of the usual animal sounds, no birds, no rustling in the underbrush. It was dead quiet. About an hour in, Dad stopped short. I nearly ran into him. He was staring at the ground, and when I looked down, my stomach did a flip. There in the mud was the biggest footprint I'd ever seen. It had to be at least 16 inches long, way bigger than any bear print. Dad knelt down to examine it, his face scrunched up in confusion. "What do you make of that, son?" he asked. I shook my head, at a loss for words. We found a few more as we continued on, all heading in the same direction. The deeper we got into the swamp, the weirder things felt. There was absolutely no sign of deer or any other animals, no droppings, no tracks, nothing. It was like they were all avoiding this area. We pushed on, following those massive prints. They led us to a small clearing, and that's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was this presence, like we were being watched. Dad must have felt it too, because he gripped his rifle tighter and scanned the tree line. That's when we heard it, this low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was almost human, but not quite. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. Dad grabbed my arm, and we started backing away slowly. Whatever was out there, it was clear we weren't welcome. We hightailed it back to our camp, both of us too shaken to speak. That night, huddled in our tent, neither of us could sleep. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had us on edge. Around midnight, a blood-curdling scream tore through the darkness. It was so loud it felt like it was right outside our tent. I've never heard anything like it. Not quite animal, not quite human. It went on for what felt like forever, rising and falling in pitch. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. Dad and I just stared at each other, wide-eyed and trembling. Neither of us dared to move or speak. As the first light of dawn broke, we cautiously emerged from the tent. The campsite looked undisturbed, but that feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Dad decided we should pack up and leave, but something made me want to investigate further. I convinced him to take one last look around before we left. We headed back towards where we'd heard the screams, moving as quietly as we could. The mist was thick again, limiting our visibility. That's when I saw them. Two gleaming eyes reflecting the early morning light, about 7 or 8 feet off the ground. They were fixed right on us. I tugged Dad's sleeve and pointed. He saw them too, and raised his rifle instinctively. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. Then there was movement in the mist, something massive shifting its weight. The eyes blinked and disappeared. Dad fired a warning shot into the air, and we heard the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush, moving away from us at incredible speed. The smell hit us then, this overpowering, musky odor that made my eyes water. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled before, a mix of wet dog and something, I don't know, almost chemical. As we stood there trying to process what had just happened, I noticed something on the ground nearby. At first, I thought it was just a pile of leaves, but as I got closer, I realized it was a huge pile of, well, poop. But it wasn't like any animal droppings I'd ever seen. It looked almost human, but way too big. Dad examined it and said it looked like whatever had left it was marking its territory. That was enough for both of us. We got out of there as fast as we could, not even bothering to break down camp properly. We just threw everything in the truck and took off. On the drive home, we tried to make sense of what we'd experienced. Dad, always the rational one, tried to explain it away. Maybe it was just a bear, or our imaginations playing tricks on us. But deep down, I think we both knew it was something else entirely. We never went back to that spot again. Dad wouldn't even talk about it after a while. But I've never forgotten. Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I still get that feeling of being watched. And on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear that scream echoing in the distance. I've spent years trying to find an explanation for what we encountered that day. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and other cryptid encounters, but nothing quite matches up with what we experienced. The size of those prints, the height of those eyes, that terrifying scream. It was all too real, too visceral to be explained away. I've thought about going back, to see if I could find any more evidence, but something always holds me back. Maybe it's fear. Or maybe it's the knowledge that some things in this world are better left undisturbed. All I know is that whatever was in those woods that day in November 1992, it wasn't anything that science can explain. It was something ancient, something powerful, and something that made it very clear we were trespassing in its domain. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods, but I'm always alert now, always listening for that scream, always watching for those eyes in the mist. Because once you've encountered something like that, you never really feel safe in the wilderness again. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the swamps of Marinette County. Part of me hopes it is, that there are still mysteries in this world, things beyond our understanding. But another part of me hopes I never encounter anything like it again. I've never shared this story publicly before. I guess I was afraid people would think I was crazy or lying. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. It was real as anything I've ever experienced. And I'll carry that knowledge and that fear with me for the rest of my life. Story 7. I'll never forget that day in May 1981. It was supposed to be just another peaceful fishing trip along the Patapsco River in Carroll County, Maryland. The weather was perfect, sunny and mild with a gentle breeze. I found a nice quiet spot along the riverbank and settled in for what I hoped would be a relaxing afternoon. Everything seemed normal at first. I was focused on my fishing, enjoying the tranquil sounds of nature around me. But then I started to hear an insistent barking coming from further downstream. At first I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just someone's dog chasing squirrels or something. But the barking continued and grew more frantic. Eventually, I decided to investigate, thinking maybe the dog was in trouble. As I made my way along the bank, I spotted a medium-sized mutt about 50 yards away. It was standing at the edge of the water, barking and growling at something up on the wooded slope above the river. I couldn't see what had the dog so riled up at first, but then I saw movement in the trees and my blood ran cold. Something massive was emerging from the forest, heading down towards the river. As it came into view, I realized with shock that it was some kind of enormous hair-covered creature. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with dark brown fur covering its entire body. I froze in place, not believing my eyes. Was this some kind of bear? But it was walking on 2 legs with an eerily human-like gait. Its arms swung at its sides as it moved, hands clearly visible. This was no bear. The creature seemed agitated by the dog's barking. It made a strange clicking or chirping sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Then, in a lightning-fast motion, it swung one massive arm and brutally swatted the dog, sending it flying several feet through the air. The poor animal yelped in pain and terror as it hit the ground. It scrambled to its feet and ran off, whimpering into the woods. I was paralyzed with fear, hardly daring to breathe. The creature stood still for a moment, as if listening. Then it slowly turned its head and seemed to look right at me. I'll never forget those eyes. They were dark and intelligent, almost human-like. But there was something alien and predatory in that gaze that chilled me to my core. For a few endless seconds, we stared at each other. Then the creature made that weird clicking noise again and lumbered off into the trees. As it moved away, a powerful musky odor hit me, a mixture of wet dog and rotting vegetation. The stench was so strong it made my eyes water. I don't know what compelled me, but once the creature was out of sight, I found myself following it. Maybe it was morbid curiosity or just shock, but I felt drawn to try and see where it went. I moved as quietly as I could through the underbrush, straining my ears for any sound of its passage. After a few minutes, I came to a small clearing. The musty smell was even stronger here. I spotted some trampled vegetation and what looked like an enormous footprint pressed into the soft earth. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real, and yet the evidence was right in front of me. Suddenly I heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Moments later, several black SUVs and police cruisers came roaring up a nearby access road, lights flashing. Men in dark suits and uniforms poured out, quickly cordoning off the area with yellow tape. They were moving with urgency, as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. I was about to approach them to report what I'd seen when one of the men spotted me. He strode over quickly, flashing some kind of official-looking badge. "Sir, this area is off limits. I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately," he said firmly. "But I saw something," I started to explain. He cut me off sharply. "Sir, for your own safety, I must insist that you vacate the premises now. This is a restricted area." His tone left no room for argument. I could see other men watching me warily, hands hovering near their weapons. The whole situation felt surreal and ominous. Not wanting any trouble, I nodded and started to back away. "I was just fishing downstream," I said, gesturing vaguely. "I'll go back to my spot." The man escorted me to the edge of the tape. As I walked away, I glanced back and saw teams of men combing the clearing, taking photos and samples. There was a palpable tension in the air, as if they were hunting something dangerous. I returned to my fishing spot in a daze, my mind whirling. What had I just witnessed? Was it some kind of unknown animal, a government experiment gone wrong? Or could it have been the legendary Bigfoot? I'd always scoffed at those stories before, but now I wasn't so sure. For hours I sat there, barely even fishing, just trying to process what had happened. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, but the image of that creature was seared into my brain. Those eyes haunted me, and that unearthly clicking sound echoed in my ears. As the sun began to set, I noticed increased activity on the road above. More vehicles arrived, including what looked like a large animal control truck. I saw men in hazmat-style suits carrying cases of equipment into the woods. A helicopter buzzed overhead, searchlights sweeping the area. I knew I should probably leave, but I couldn't tear myself away. I had to know what was going on. As full darkness fell, the woods came alive with flashlights and shouting. It seemed like they were searching for something, or someone. Then I heard it again, that bizarre chirping noise, but more frantic this time. It was coming from further upstream. A ripple of excitement went through the search teams. Voices shouted commands, and I saw groups converging on the area. Suddenly there was a tremendous crashing sound, like something huge plowing through the underbrush. Shouts of alarm rang out. Gunshots echoed through the night. My heart was pounding as I strained to see what was happening in the darkness. A beam of light caught something moving, a massive shape hurtling down the slope towards the river. It was the creature, and it was heading straight for me. I scrambled backwards, nearly falling in my panic. The thing splashed into the shallows just yards away. For a split second, our eyes met again. I saw pain and fear in that gaze, along with something that looked almost like intelligence, understanding. Then it was gone, vanishing into the deeper water with hardly a ripple. The searchlights swept the river, but there was no sign of the creature. It had simply disappeared. In the chaos that followed, I managed to slip away unnoticed. I got in my truck and drove home in a state of shock. For days afterwards, I obsessively checked the news for any mention of what had happened, but there was nothing, not a single report about a giant creature or a massive search operation in Carroll County. It was as if the whole incident had been erased. I've spent years trying to make sense of what I saw that day. Was it all just a vivid hallucination, some kind of mass delusion? Or did I truly encounter something beyond scientific explanation? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I know what I saw. And the memory of those eyes still haunts my dreams to this day. Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I think I hear that strange clicking sound in the distance, and I wonder, is it still out there, watching and waiting? Will anyone ever truly know the truth of what lurks in the dark forests of America? All I know is that my experience that day changed me forever. I'll never look at the world the same way again. Story 8. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights illuminated what I initially thought was a man in a brown jacket standing on the shoulder. I slowed down, worried they might need help in this nasty weather. But as I got closer, I realized something was very wrong. This figure was massive, way too big to be human. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. And that jacket wasn't clothing at all, but thick, matted fur covering its entire body. My blood ran cold as I realized I was looking at some kind of creature I couldn't explain. Time seemed to stand still as I stared at it in shock. The creature slowly turned its head to look directly at me. Its eyes reflected my headlights, glowing an eerie yellowish green. The face was ape-like, but with strangely human features. Long arms hung down past its knees. I was frozen in terror, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Every instinct screamed at me to floor it and get out of there, but I was paralyzed. The creature and I locked eyes for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then it let out a deep, guttural growl that I felt vibrate through my whole body. That snapped me out of my daze, and I slammed on the gas pedal. As I sped past, I caught a glimpse of it in my rearview mirror. It had turned to watch me go, still standing motionless in the rain. I drove home in a panic, constantly checking my mirrors to make sure it wasn't following me. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there shaking for several minutes before I felt steady enough to go inside. I didn't sleep at all that night, jumping at every little sound and half expecting to see that creature's face peering in my windows. For weeks afterward, I was on edge constantly. I avoided driving on rural roads at night if I could help it. When I did have to, I'd white-knuckle the steering wheel the whole time, eyes darting to the tree line searching for any sign of movement. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I was afraid people would think I was crazy or laugh it off, so I kept it to myself, trying to convince myself it had just been a bear or my eyes playing tricks on me in the rain and darkness. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. It wasn't like anything that should exist in this world. The image of those glowing eyes and that massive fur-covered body was burned into my brain. About a year later, I was having a beer with my dad, and the conversation turned to local urban legends. To my shock, he started talking about a strange encounter he'd had while hunting in the woods near where I'd seen the creature. He described seeing a huge ape-like beast walking on 2 legs through a clearing. When I pressed him for details, they matched up eerily well with what I'd witnessed. A chill ran down my spine as he spoke. I wanted to tell him about my own experience, but the words stuck in my throat. I still wasn't ready to open up about it. It wasn't until a few years later that I finally broke my silence. My sister and I were reminiscing about our childhood, swapping stories about growing up in rural Wisconsin. Out of nowhere, she mentioned a frightening incident from when she was in high school. She and some friends had been hanging out at a bonfire in the woods when they heard strange vocalizations and saw a huge, shadowy figure moving through the trees nearby. As she described it, I felt the blood drain from my face. It was too similar to ignore. With shaking hands, I poured myself a stiff drink and finally told them both about that rainy night in 1994. To my immense relief, they didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, they listened intently, asking questions and comparing notes about our encounters. It was cathartic to finally talk about it after keeping it bottled up for so long. We spent hours that night discussing our experiences and researching similar sightings in the area. It turns out there's a long history of strange creature encounters in the forests of Wisconsin. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others think it's something else entirely. Whatever it was, I know what I saw that night was real. The relief of sharing my story with my family was immense, but it also dredged up all those old feelings of fear and unease. Even now, nearly 30 years later, I still get a knot in my stomach when I think about it. I've never seen the creature again, thankfully, but I'm much more aware of my surroundings when I'm in the woods now. I'm always listening for unusual sounds or movement in the undergrowth. Part of me hopes I'll never encounter it again, but another part is intensely curious to know more about what's out there. Since opening up about my experience, I've connected with other people online who've had similar encounters. It's both comforting and unsettling to know I'm not alone. Some of their stories send chills down my spine. Sightings of not just one creature, but groups of them. Strange structures found deep in the forest. Unsettling vocalizations in the night. I don't know what to make of it all. I'm not someone who's prone to believing in the supernatural or buying into conspiracy theories. But I know what I saw, and I can't explain it. It's made me question a lot of what I thought I knew about the world. These days, I still live in the same area. I've thought about moving away, but this is my home. Plus, part of me feels like I need to stay vigilant, to keep an eye out for any more strange occurrences. I've become something of an amateur researcher, documenting local sightings and comparing notes with others who've had encounters. I still drive that same stretch of road sometimes, usually during the day. But on rare occasions when I have to take it at night, I always slow down at that bend. My heart races as I scan the tree line, both dreading and half hoping to catch another glimpse of that mysterious creature. So far, it hasn't reappeared. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching and waiting in the depths of the forest. And I wonder how many other people have seen something similar but are too afraid to come forward. If you're reading this and you've had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. And if you haven't, well, keep your eyes open next time you're driving down a dark country road on a rainy night. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the reach of your headlights. Story 9. I live in St. Croix County, Wisconsin, a pretty rural area with lots of forests and farmland. It was around 9:30 p.m. and I was cruising down County Road E, a quiet two-lane road that winds through the countryside. The moon was bright that night, casting an eerie glow over the fields and trees. I had the radio on low, half listening to some classic rock as I drove. My mind was wandering, thinking about plans for the weekend. Maybe I'd do some yard work if the weather was nice, or catch up on some reading, just normal, mundane stuff. Suddenly, something caught my eye up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, but as I got closer, I realized there was definitely something there on the side of the road. My headlights illuminated it as I approached. What I saw next made my blood run cold. Standing there, right at the edge of the pavement, was the most terrifying creature I've ever laid eyes on. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The thing that struck me most was its bizarre coloring. It had silvery white fur covering its massive body, with patches of grey mixed in. In the glow of my headlights, the fur seemed to shimmer unnaturally. Its proportions were all wrong for a human or any animal I knew of. The shoulders were impossibly broad and hunched, leading directly into its head with virtually no neck visible. Long, powerful arms hung down past its knees. For a split second, our eyes met. Its face was eerily human-like, with deep-set eyes that reflected red in my headlights. The expression was one of cold intelligence that sent chills down my spine. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, my tires screeching on the asphalt. The creature turned its massive head to look directly at me as my car skidded to a stop about 30 feet away. Pure, primal terror gripped me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just sat there frozen, staring at this impossible thing. Then it moved. With shocking speed for something so large, it took a step towards my car. That's when I lost it. I started screaming at the top of my lungs, a sound of raw fear that I didn't even recognize as my own voice. My body was flooded with adrenaline. I fumbled frantically with the gear shift, my hands shaking violently. I managed to throw the car into reverse and stomped on the gas pedal. The tires spun, kicking up gravel, before finally gripping the road. I craned my neck to look behind me as I reversed at full speed, terrified of hitting something, but even more afraid of taking my eyes off that creature. It was following me. Its gait was unnaturally smooth as it loped alongside my car, easily keeping pace. Those blazing red eyes never left mine. I've never felt so helpless and afraid in my life. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, I spun the wheel and shifted into drive, burning rubber as I accelerated forward. I pushed my old Chevy to its limits, the engine roaring as I fled down that lonely country road. I didn't slow down until I reached the outskirts of town, my hands clenched so tight on the steering wheel that my knuckles were white. I was drenched in cold sweat, gasping for breath. It took everything I had not to break down completely. As the initial shock faded, my mind raced. What the hell had I just seen? It couldn't be real. Maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion. But no, I knew deep down that what I witnessed was all too real. I made it home in a daze and locked every door and window. Sleep was out of the question. I sat up all night with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was just a vivid nightmare. But I knew better. And as I sat there in the harsh light of day, a chilling memory surfaced, one I had repressed for years. It was the summer of 1992. My buddy Tom and I decided to go camping up in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. We found a nice secluded spot by a small lake and set up our tent. The first day and night were great, hiking, fishing, drinking a few beers around the campfire. But on the second night, things took a dark turn. We had turned in around 11 p.m., exhausted from a day of activities. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard it, the distinct sound of branches snapping nearby. At first I thought it was probably just a deer or something, but then I heard heavy footsteps, way too big for any normal forest animal. I nudged Tom awake, and we listened in tense silence. The footsteps were moving around our campsite, circling the tent. Occasionally we'd hear strange grunting noises, unlike anything I'd heard before. This went on for what felt like hours. We were too terrified to even whisper to each other, let alone look outside. Eventually, whatever it was moved off into the forest. We barely slept a wink that night. In the morning, we found massive footprints all around our campsite, easily 18 inches long. There were also broken branches high up in the surrounding trees, snapped off at a height no human could reach. We packed up and got out of there as fast as we could. On the drive home, we tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a bear, we told ourselves, but deep down, we knew it was something else, something that shouldn't exist. We made a pact never to speak of it again, and over time, I managed to mostly forget about that terrifying night. Until now. Sitting in my living room that morning after the roadside encounter, it all came flooding back. The fear, the confusion, the sense of brushing up against something beyond human understanding. I knew then that what I saw on that road was the same creature that had stalked our campsite years ago, and I knew with grim certainty that it was still out there, roaming the forests of Wisconsin. I've never told anyone this story before now. Who would believe me? I can barely believe it myself most days. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. Sometimes late at night, when the wind is howling outside and the shadows seem to move, I still hear those heavy footsteps circling. And I wonder, is it out there right now, watching and waiting? Will I see those blazing red eyes again someday? I don't go camping anymore. I avoid driving on rural roads at night. But no matter what precautions I take, I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, our paths will cross again. And next time, I may not be lucky enough to escape. Story 10. I was out deer hunting in Dane County, Wisconsin back in September 1989. It was a crisp fall day, and I'd been looking forward to the start of hunting season all year. I'd scouted out a good spot deep in the woods where I'd seen plenty of deer sign. As I hiked out to my hunting blind before dawn, I felt that familiar mix of excitement and anticipation. The morning passed uneventfully. I saw a few does in the distance, but nothing in range. As the day wore on, I started to get a bit restless. That's when I heard something moving at the edge of the forest about 50 yards away. At first I thought it might be a deer, so I let out a soft call. But the response I got sent chills down my spine, a deep, guttural growl unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It definitely wasn't a deer or any animal I was familiar with. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. The growl faded, and I didn't hear any more movement. After a few tense minutes, I convinced myself it must have just been a bear or something and tried to relax. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had come over me. As the afternoon went on, I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see whatever had made that sound. But the woods remained still and quiet. Just as I was starting to think about packing it in for the day, that's when things got really weird. Off to my right, maybe 150 feet away, I noticed some strange movement in the underbrush. At first it was subtle, just some branches swaying a bit. But then entire saplings started shaking violently. Something big was pushing its way through the dense forest. My heart was pounding as I strained to see what was causing the disturbance. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of something dark moving between the trees. It was huge, way bigger than a person. I saw what looked like arms and legs, but the proportions were all wrong. The limbs were incredibly long and moved in an unnatural way. Before I could process what I was seeing, a rock came hurtling out of the woods straight at me. I ducked just in time as it whizzed over my head. Then another rock crashed into a tree trunk just a few feet away. Whatever this thing was, it was throwing rocks at me. I abandoned all thoughts of hunting and just focused on getting the hell out of there. I scrambled to grab my gear, keeping low to avoid the barrage of rocks. As I ran, I could hear heavy footsteps crashing through the woods behind me. The sound of snapping branches and angry grunts spurred me to run faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out of there, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see some monster emerging from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the empty dirt road stretching out behind me. It took me a long time to calm down enough to drive safely. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Those weren't normal animal movements, and what kind of creature could throw rocks like that? The image of those long, dark limbs moving through the trees was burned into my brain. When I got home, I was still so shaken up that my wife immediately knew something was wrong. I tried to explain what happened, but I could tell she didn't really believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But I know what I saw out there. I didn't go back to those woods for a long time after that. When I finally worked up the courage to return the next season, I didn't see anything unusual, but I could never shake the feeling of being watched whenever I was out there. To this day, I'm not sure exactly what I encountered, but I know it was something that shouldn't exist, something that's not supposed to be real. I've replayed that day in my head countless times over the years. Could it have been a bear, a moose? But deep down, I know it wasn't any normal animal. The way it moved, the intelligence it displayed by throwing rocks, it was something else entirely. I've heard stories about Bigfoot sightings, but I always thought they were just tall tales. Now I'm not so sure. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll come across an old bruise from one of those rocks, or I'll wake up in a cold sweat from a nightmare about those inhuman limbs moving through the trees, and I know it was real. I've never told many people about what happened that day. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw out there in those Wisconsin woods. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that we're not meant to understand. And sometimes, if you venture too far off the beaten path, you might just encounter one of them. I still go hunting from time to time, but never alone, and never in that particular area. The memory of that day still haunts me. Every snapping twig or rustling bush makes me tense up. I'm always scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those unnatural movements again. I've done some research over the years, trying to find any similar reports from that area. While I haven't found anything exactly like my experience, there have been a few vague reports of strange noises and unexplained phenomena in those woods. It makes me wonder how many other people have had encounters they were too afraid to talk about. Sometimes I think about going back there with a camera, trying to capture proof of what I saw. But then I remember the terror I felt that day, the primal fear of being hunted by something unknown. And I realize some things are better left alone. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened that September day in 1989. It changed the way I see the world, made me question everything I thought I knew about nature and reality itself. All I know for sure is that there are mysteries out there in the wild places of the world, things that don't fit neatly into our understanding of what's possible. So if you're ever out in the woods and you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, or see movement that seems just a little off, trust your instincts. There might be more out there than you're prepared to face, and some encounters are better left as stories told around a campfire, never to be experienced firsthand. As for me, I'll keep this experience locked away in my memory, a reminder that the world is stranger and more terrifying than we can imagine, and I'll always keep one eye on the shadows when I'm in the forest, wondering if I'll ever catch another glimpse of the impossible. Story 11. I'll never forget that day in July 1970. I was 15 years old, out for a ride on my pony with my dog trotting alongside us. It was a beautiful summer afternoon in Washington County. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. I loved exploring the rural back roads and wooded hills near our farm. As we ambled down an old dirt road, I spotted a gap in the trees that looked like it might lead to a nice view. I steered my pony off the road, and we picked our way through the underbrush. The trees opened up into a small clearing on a hillside, giving us a sweeping view of the valley below. An old wooden fence ran along the edge of the clearing, weathered and sagging with age. I was admiring the view when movement on the other side of the fence caught my eye. At first I thought it was just shadows from the trees swaying in the breeze, but then I saw it clearly, a massive, dark figure moving through the woods on the far side of the fence. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with a bulky, muscular build. Dark fur or hair covered its body. It moved on 2 legs, with a smooth, loping gait, nothing like a bear's awkward waddle. For a moment I wondered if it could be a person in some kind of costume, but the way it moved was too fluid, too natural. This was a living creature, not a man in a suit. My mind raced, trying to identify what kind of animal it could possibly be. A bear? An escaped gorilla? But it was too big for a normal animal, and walked upright with an almost human-like gait. I sat frozen on my pony, afraid to move or make a sound. The creature hadn't seemed to notice us yet. It was moving parallel to the fence line, about 50 yards away through the trees. I watched in awe as it easily stepped over fallen logs and pushed through dense underbrush, its powerful form cutting a path through the forest. Suddenly it stopped, and turned its head in our direction. I caught a glimpse of a face that was somehow both ape-like and disturbingly human. Dark eyes peered out from beneath a heavy brow. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it must be audible. To my shock, my pony and dog seemed completely unaware of the creature's presence. My pony continued calmly grazing, while my dog sat placidly at my feet. How could they not sense this massive predator so close by? Their lack of reaction only added to the surreal, dreamlike quality of the moment. The creature and I stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest, moving with surprising stealth and silence for something so large. I sat there stunned for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Part of me wondered if I had imagined it or hallucinated somehow. But I knew deep down that what I'd seen was real, however impossible it seemed. Finally, I snapped out of my daze and urged my pony into a trot, hurrying back towards home. My mind was reeling as I tried to make sense of the encounter. What on earth was that thing? How had it gone undetected in these woods that I thought I knew so well? And why hadn't my animals reacted to its presence? When I got home, I was bursting to tell someone what had happened, but I hesitated, unsure of how to even begin explaining it. I knew how crazy it would sound, so I kept quiet, convinced that no one would believe me anyway. Over the next few weeks, I scoured the local newspapers for any reports of strange sightings or unidentified animals in the area. But there was nothing. Life went on as normal, and I started to doubt my own memory of that day. I avoided riding in that area of the woods for the rest of the summer. When school started back up in the fall, the encounter began to fade like a strange dream. But I never forgot it completely. Years passed. I grew up, went to college, got married, and had kids of my own. We stayed in the area, and my parents still lived in my childhood home. I never told anyone about what I'd seen that day, convinced they would think I was crazy. Then, one afternoon in the summer of 1978, I was visiting my parents with my young children. We were sitting around the kitchen table when my mother casually mentioned seeing something strange in the woods behind the house a few days earlier. I was washing dishes and happened to glance out the window, she said. There was this huge, dark shape moving through the trees. At first I thought it was a bear, but it was walking on two legs. It disappeared into the woods before I could get a good look. I felt the blood drain from my face as she spoke. Could it be the same creature I had encountered all those years ago? I was both relieved to have some confirmation that I wasn't crazy, and unsettled to think that this thing was still out there. I finally told my mother about my own sighting. She listened with wide eyes, and I could see she believed me. We speculated about what it could be: Bigfoot, some unknown species, an escaped exotic pet. But we had no answers. To this day, I still don't know what I saw in those woods. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and similar creatures over the years. Some details match up with my experience, but others don't quite fit. The fact that my animals didn't react still baffles me. I've never seen the creature again, despite keeping a watchful eye on the woods whenever I visit my old hometown. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the primal fear I felt that day, the absolute certainty that I was in the presence of something extraordinary and potentially dangerous. Whatever it was, that encounter changed how I view the world. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are still mysteries out there, things that defy explanation. I'm more open-minded now, more willing to consider that the world is stranger and more wonderful than we realize. I still go hiking in those woods sometimes, though I always feel a little on edge. Part of me hopes to catch another glimpse of that creature, to prove to myself once and for all that it was real. But another part of me is afraid of what might happen if I did encounter it again. so I keep the memory of that day locked away, only sharing it with my closest family. But I'll never forget the mixture of awe and terror I felt as I watched that massive, impossible creature move through the forest. It was a moment that defied everything I thought I knew about the world, and it stayed with me all these years later. Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I'll catch a whiff of a musky animal scent on the breeze or hear the snap of a branch in the distance. And for a moment, I'm transported back to that summer day in 1970, wondering what other secrets these ancient forests might be hiding. Story 12. The morning started like any other opening day. I woke up before dawn, excited to get out there and hopefully bag a nice buck. My buddy Jake and I had been planning this trip for weeks. We drove out to our usual spot, parked the truck, and geared up. Jake headed off to set up in his favorite blind, while I decided to try a new area I'd scouted earlier in the year. After a few hours of no luck, I decided to head back to the truck to warm up and grab some coffee from the thermos. It was a crisp November day, with a light dusting of snow on the ground. As I approached our meeting spot near the vehicle, I noticed Jake wasn't there yet. No big deal. I figured he was probably still out there trying his luck. I leaned against the truck, sipping my coffee and enjoying the peacefulness of the forest. That's when I heard it, a sound coming from the tree line about 50 yards away. At first, I thought it was Jake making his way back. "Hey Jake, over here," I called out. But the response I got sent chills down my spine. Instead of Jake's voice, I heard a deep, guttural growl. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a wolf, nothing I could identify. My heart started racing as I realized whatever made that sound was big, really big. I stood frozen, straining my eyes to see into the shadows of the forest edge. That's when I noticed movement. Something massive was walking parallel to the tree line, staying just inside the cover of the trees. As it moved, I could hear branches snapping under its weight. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to be about my height, around 6 feet tall, but much, much broader. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing and hearing. Was this some kind of bear? But the way it was moving, almost upright, didn't match any bear behavior I'd ever encountered. And that growl, it haunts me still. I fumbled for my rifle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. Part of me wanted to run, to jump in the truck and speed away. But I was paralyzed with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I kept telling myself this couldn't be real, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The creature continued its path along the forest edge, maintaining a steady pace. It was like it was patrolling, marking its territory. I could hear its heavy breathing now, a deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Suddenly, it stopped. The forest went eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and pounding heart. I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest movement would draw its attention. Then, without warning, I heard a series of loud, sharp cracks, like someone snapping thick branches. It was coming from where the creature had stopped. Was it breaking branches intentionally, trying to intimidate me? My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. I don't know how long I stood there, rifle half raised, barely breathing. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Gradually, I became aware of a new sound. Footsteps crunching through the snow, coming from a different direction. Human footsteps. "Hey man, you okay?" Jake's voice broke through my terror-induced trance. I spun around, nearly dropping my rifle in the process. Jake was standing there, looking at me with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I possibly describe what I'd just experienced? Would he even believe me? I glanced back towards the tree line, but there was no sign of the creature. No broken branches, no footprints, nothing. I thought I saw something, I finally managed to stammer out. In the woods. It was big, Jake, really big. And it made this sound. Jake looked at me skeptically. A bear, maybe? Or a moose? Though we don't get many of those around here. I shook my head. No, it wasn't. It was walking upright. And that growl, I've never heard anything like it. We spent the next hour searching the area, but found no evidence of whatever I'd seen. No tracks, no hair, no broken branches, nothing. Jake was supportive, but I could tell he thought I'd just spooked myself somehow. Maybe I'd dozed off and had a vivid dream. But I knew what I saw, what I heard. It was real. We cut our trip short and headed home that day. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as we drove away. Since then, I've been obsessively researching, trying to find any explanation for what I encountered. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, about strange creatures in the woods, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. I haven't been able to bring myself to go back to those woods. The memory of that growl, the sound of those heavy footsteps, the sheer size of whatever was moving through the trees, it's all burned into my mind. I find myself jumping at shadows, startling at every unexpected sound. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story a week ago, I'd have thought they were crazy or making it up. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. There's something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist. And the scariest part? I don't think it was as afraid of me as I was of it. I'm sharing this because I need to know if anyone else has experienced anything similar. Has anyone else encountered something they can't explain in the woods of Dane County? Am I going crazy, or is there really something out there that defies explanation? I don't know if I'll ever get answers. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe in those woods again. But I do know that my view of the world has been forever changed. There are things out there, just beyond the edge of the forest, that we can't begin to understand. And sometimes they let us know they're watching. Story 13. I was out hunting again with my buddy Mike in the same area we'd been to a couple weeks back. It was a crisp fall morning, and we were hoping to bag a deer or two. Everything seemed normal at first, just the usual sounds of the forest waking up around us. We'd been walking for about an hour when I started to get this weird feeling, like we were being watched. I tried to shake it off, but it kept nagging at me. I glanced over at Mike and could tell he was on edge too. That's when we heard it, this low, guttural sound echoing through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Mike. He nodded, eyes wide. We froze in place, straining our ears. The sound came again, closer this time. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Suddenly, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. About 40 yards away, something was moving between the trees. At first I thought it might be a bear, but as I focused on it, I realized it was something else entirely. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall. And its limbs, they were this deep, dark red color, almost like dried blood. I blinked hard, certain I must be seeing things. But when I looked again, it was still there. "Mike," I hissed, "do you see that?" He nodded mutely, rifle clutched tightly to his chest. The creature moved with an eerie, fluid grace. One minute it was there, the next it had vanished behind a thick stand of pines. I kept trying to get a clear look at it, but it was like my eyes couldn't quite focus properly. A twig snapped loudly, and we both jumped. The thing was definitely getting closer. I raised my rifle, trying to steady my shaking hands. That's when the trees started moving. At first I thought it was just the wind picking up, But then I realized the breeze was still light, nowhere near strong enough to make the treetops thrash around like that. It was like something massive was shaking them from below. A primal fear gripped me. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I felt frozen in place, unable to look away from the violently swaying branches. Suddenly, something small and hard hit me in the shoulder. I yelped in surprise and pain. "What the hell?" Mike exclaimed. Another projectile whizzed past my ear. I ducked just as a third one struck Mike in the chest. "They're throwing rocks at us," I shouted. We stumbled backwards, trying to find cover. The rocks kept coming, growing larger by the second. What started as pebbles the size of marbles quickly became stones as big as golf balls. One caught me in the shin, and I went down hard, crying out in pain. Mike grabbed my arm and hauled me back to my feet. We ran blindly through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. The barrage continued. I could hear the rocks thudding into tree trunks all around us. One the size of a baseball struck me square in the back, knocking the wind out of me. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, a rock the size of a softball came hurtling out of the trees. It missed my head by inches. If it had connected, it would have killed me for sure. We ran until our lungs were burning, not daring to look back. Finally, we burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. The attack stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Gasping for air, we spun around, guns at the ready. But there was nothing there. Just trees swaying gently in the breeze, as if nothing had happened. We stood there for what felt like hours, barely breathing, straining to hear any sign of pursuit. But the forest had gone eerily silent. Finally, Mike spoke. What the hell was that thing?" I shook my head, still trying to process what we'd just experienced. "I don't know, man. I've never seen anything like it." We were both covered in cuts and bruises from the rocks and our mad dash through the woods. My shin was already swelling up where I'd been hit. "We need to get out of here," I said. Mike nodded emphatically. We made our way back to the truck as quickly as we could, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. I kept expecting to see that massive red-limbed shape lurking behind every tree. But we made it back without further incident. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just narrowly escaped with our lives. What was that thing? Why had it attacked us? And how the hell had it thrown rocks that size with such force and accuracy? I've been an avid hunter and outdoorsman my whole life. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand. But now I'm not so sure. There's something out there, something that doesn't want us in its territory. I haven't been back to those woods since that day. Just thinking about it makes my palms sweat and my heart race. I keep replaying it over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of what happened. But I can't. It defies all logic and reason. All I know is that I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. Something that has haunted my nightmares ever since. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot or some other cryptid. Hell, maybe it was something not of this world entirely. But I know what I saw. What I experienced. And I'll never forget the terror of those moments in the woods when the impossible became terrifyingly real. I've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away. Maybe we stumbled into some kind of secret military testing ground, or maybe it was an elaborate hoax. But deep down, I know that's not the case. The fear I felt that day was too visceral, too primal to have been caused by anything human. I've done some research since then, looking for similar accounts. And while I've found a few stories that come close, nothing quite matches what Mike and I encountered. It's like this thing was unique, a one-of-a-kind monster that decided to make its home in our local woods. The worst part is the not knowing what it was, why it attacked us, or if it's still out there. Every time I hear about a hiker going missing in those woods, I can't help but wonder if they had a run-in with the same creature. I've thought about reporting it to the authorities, but what would I even say? "Officer, I saw a giant red-armed monster throwing boulders in the forest. They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. So I've kept it to myself, only sharing it with a few close friends who I trust won't judge me. But the experience has changed me. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the fact that there are things in this world that we can't explain or understand. I still go hunting, but never in those woods. And I'm always on high alert, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The sound of branches snapping makes my heart race. Even the wind in the leaves sometimes sounds like that low, inhuman growl we heard that day. It's been years now, but the memory is as fresh as if it happened yesterday. The image of those blood-red limbs moving through the trees is seared into my brain. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of rocks pelting my body lingering from a nightmare. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened that day. It challenged everything I thought I knew about the world and what exists in it. But I know what I saw, what I felt, and no amount of rational thinking or skepticism can erase that experience. So I'm left with this story, a tale that sounds too fantastic to be true, but one that I swear on my life actually happened. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I can barely believe it myself. But I know the truth, and I'll carry that truth, and the fear that comes with it, for the rest of my life. Story 14. There were 5 of us, me, my brother Tom, and our friends Mike, John, and Dave. We'd grown up together in this sleepy Washington town, spending countless summer evenings at that very spot. But this night was different. As we approached the water's edge, laughing and joking around, an eerie stillness fell over the area. The crickets stopped chirping, and even the gentle lapping of the water seemed to quiet down. That's when we saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim moonlight. But as I squinted into the darkness, my blood ran cold. Standing on the opposite bank, partially obscured by the trees, was a massive figure unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, with a hulking, muscular frame covered in dark fur. But it was the face that haunts me to this day, unmistakably ape-like, yet with an unsettling intelligence in its eyes that seemed almost human. Those eyes, they were fixed directly on us, unblinking and intense. For what felt like an eternity, we all stood frozen in shock and disbelief. Then Dave, always the impulsive one, reached for the .22 rifle he'd brought along to do some plinking. Before any of us could stop him, he raised the gun and fired off a shot. The crack of the rifle shattered the silence, but the creature didn't even flinch. It was as if the bullet had simply passed through it or bounced off its thick hide. That's when true panic set in. We'd all heard the legends of Bigfoot, but to actually see one, and to realize our weapons were useless against it, was more than our minds could handle. We turned and ran faster than I thought humanly possible, stumbling over rocks and branches in our desperation to get away. I could feel the creature's gaze boring into my back as we fled, certain that at any moment those massive hands would grab me and pull me into the darkness. Somehow, we made it back to our truck. Tom fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could hardly get them in the ignition. As we peeled out onto the road, kicking up a cloud of dust behind us, I dared to glance back one last time. There, at the edge of the trees, I swear I could still see those eyes gleaming in the darkness. We drove straight to the sheriff's office, babbling incoherently about what we'd seen. The deputy on duty clearly thought we were drunk or playing some kind of prank. But as he looked at our pale, sweat-drenched faces and trembling hands, I could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The next day, a small search party went out to the area, but they found nothing. No footprints, no hair, no sign that anything out of the ordinary had been there. Some folks in town laughed it off, saying we must have seen a bear or let our imaginations run wild. But those of us who were there that night, we know the truth. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face, those unnervingly intelligent eyes staring back at me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, certain I could hear heavy footsteps outside my window. I started doing research, reading every book and article I could find about Bigfoot sightings. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that what we'd encountered wasn't just some unknown animal, but something far more complex and intelligent. The thing that struck me most was how the creature hadn't acted aggressively towards us. Despite Dave firing at it, it made no move to attack or chase us. It was almost as if it was simply curious, studying us, the way a scientist might observe a new species. That realization didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it only deepened the sense of unease that had taken root in my soul. What if these creatures, and I was becoming increasingly certain there were more of them out there, were far more intelligent than we'd ever imagined? What if they'd been watching us all along, hidden just beyond the edges of our civilized world? As the years have passed, I've never been able to shake the memory of that night. I've heard other stories from people in the area, hikers who've had similar encounters, campers who've woken to find massive footprints around their sites, but none of them have ever seen the creature as clearly as we did. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself drawn back to that spot by the dike. I never go too close, never stay after dark. But as I stand there, looking out over the water, I can't help but wonder, is it out there still, watching and waiting? And if so, what does it want from us? I know many people won't believe my story. Hell, there are days I can hardly believe it myself. But I know what I saw that night, what we all saw. And I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, there are secrets and mysteries that defy our understanding. To this day, I can't explain why the creature appeared to us that night, or why it vanished just as suddenly. Was it a chance encounter, or was there some greater purpose to its appearance? These questions haunt me, keeping me awake on long, dark nights. I've never been much for the spotlight, never wanted to be one of those people shouting about conspiracies or trying to get famous off a wild story, but I feel like I have a responsibility to share what happened to us, not to convince anyone, but just to put it out there. Because if there's even a chance that these creatures are real, that they're out there watching us, don't we owe it to ourselves to try to understand them? So that's my story. Take from it what you will. But the next time you're out in the woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like someone's watching you, well, just remember. Sometimes the legends we dismiss as campfire tales have more truth to them than we'd like to admit. And if you ever find yourself face to face with something you can't explain, something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world, my advice would be this: don't run, don't shoot, just watch and listen. Because maybe, just maybe, it's trying to tell us something important, something we've forgotten in our rush to conquer and understand every corner of this planet. As for me, I'll keep watching the woods, keep listening for heavy footsteps in the night. Because I know now that there are wonders and terrors out there beyond our wildest imaginings. And somewhere, in the shadows between the trees, those eyes are still watching, still waiting. For what? I may never know, but I'll never stop trying to find out. Story 15. On this particular Saturday, I decided to check out Beacon Rock State Park in Washington. I'd heard there were some interesting caves to explore there. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm, but not too hot. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and a flashlight, then made the drive out to the park. When I got there around mid-morning, I started hiking up one of the trails that wound through the forest. After about an hour, I veered off onto a less established path that seemed to lead towards some rocky outcroppings. That's when I stumbled upon the entrance to a cave I hadn't read about in any of the guidebooks. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a look inside. The opening was fairly narrow, but I was able to squeeze through. I clicked on my flashlight as I entered the cool darkness of the cave. The beam of light revealed a passageway that curved deeper into the rock. I carefully made my way forward, the only sounds being my own footsteps and breathing echoing off the stone walls. The air felt damp and had an earthy, musty smell. After about 50 feet, the passage opened up into a larger cavern. As I swung my flashlight around to survey the space, that's when I saw it. In a shadowy recess towards the back of the cavern, I caught a glimpse of what looked like fur or hair. At first I thought it might be some kind of animal den, but as I crept closer for a better look, my blood ran cold. What I saw was unmistakably a massive hair-covered foot. It was easily twice the size of a human foot, but the shape was disturbingly human-like. I could make out individual toes with flattened claw-like nails. The fur covering it was a dark brown color. I stood there frozen, my mind racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. Was this some kind of bear? But bears don't have feet that look like that. Could it be? No, that was impossible. Those were just stories. Before I could think any further, I saw the toes of the foot twitch slightly. A bolt of terror shot through me as I realized whatever this thing was, it was alive and probably sleeping. I didn't stick around to see anything more. Pure survival instinct kicked in, and I turned and ran as fast as I could back through the passageway. I was so panicked I smacked my head on the low ceiling at one point, but I barely felt it. My heart was pounding out of my chest by the time I burst out of the cave entrance into the sunlight. I didn't stop running until I was back on the main trail. Only then did I pause to catch my breath and try to calm down. As the adrenaline faded, I started to doubt what I'd seen. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dark cave. Maybe it was just some weird rock formation that looked like a foot. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. What I saw was real. I debated whether to report it to the park rangers, but I was afraid they'd think I was crazy or on drugs. Who would believe a story about a giant, hairy, humanoid creature sleeping in a cave? I decided to keep it to myself and get the hell out of there. The drive home was a blur. I kept replaying the image of that foot in my mind, trying to rationalize it. But I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of wrongness. Whatever that thing was, it didn't belong in our world. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those toes twitching. I imagined the creature waking up and coming after me. Even though I was safe in my apartment in Portland, I felt like I was being watched. The next day, I scoured the local newspapers for any strange reports from the park. But there was nothing. Life went on as normal for everyone else, while I was haunted by what I'd seen. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with researching Bigfoot sightings and other strange creatures. I read every book I could find on the subject. I even went back to Beacon Rock a few times, but I never worked up the courage to go near that cave again. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that day. Was it really Bigfoot? Some unknown species? A government experiment gone wrong? I'll probably never know for sure. But the memory of that massive fur-covered foot is seared into my brain forever. Sometimes I wonder if I should have done more, tried to get evidence or alert the authorities. But mostly, I'm just grateful I got out of there alive. Whatever was sleeping in that cave that day, I have a feeling it wouldn't have been happy to be woken up by a nosy hiker. I still go hiking occasionally, but never alone anymore. And I always carry a bigger flashlight, just in case. That encounter changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Things that lurk in the shadows, just out of sight. To this day, I get chills when I hear about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Part of me hopes someone will find proof someday, so I'll know I'm not crazy. But another part hopes that creature is never found. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've never told anyone this story before. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I swear I can hear heavy footsteps outside my window. Probably just my imagination. At least that's what I tell myself. Story 16. It was a hot, humid day, and we decided to head down to our usual spot by the creek to cool off. As we walked along the muddy bank, joking and shoving each other like usual, I suddenly froze in my tracks. About 50 yards ahead of us, emerging from behind a thick cluster of trees, was the largest, strangest creature I'd ever seen. At first glance, I thought it was a bear, but then I realized it was walking on 2 legs. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall and broader than any man I'd ever seen. But what really struck me was the thick, matted fur covering its entire body. It was a dark, reddish-brown color and hung in clumps, swaying as the creature moved. For a split second, we all just stood there in shocked silence. Then Tom whispered, "What the hell is that thing?" And the creature's head whipped around to face us. I'll never forget those eyes. They were dark and intelligent, almost human-like, but filled with a primal wildness that sent chills down my spine. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. Then suddenly the spell was broken as the creature let out a hair-raising roar. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. My body flooded with adrenaline, and without even thinking, I turned and ran. I could hear Jack and Tom's footsteps pounding behind me as we tore through the woods, branches whipping our faces. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see. After what felt like an eternity, we finally burst out of the tree line near the main road. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. Did you guys see that?" Jack panted. Tom and I could only nod, still too out of breath to speak. As the initial panic faded, we started to process what we'd just witnessed. "It looked like some kind of giant ape man," Tom said. "But that's impossible, right?" I didn't know what to think. I'd heard old tales about Bigfoot and Sasquatch, but I'd always assumed they were just campfire stories. Now I wasn't so sure. As we caught our breath, we debated whether to tell anyone what we'd seen. Who would believe us? We'd probably just get laughed at or accused of making it up. In the end, curiosity got the better of us. We decided to go back to the creek the next day to look for any evidence. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with images of that creature. What if it was still out there? What if it decided to come into town? The next morning, we headed back to the creek, armed with my dad's old Polaroid camera. As we neared the spot where we'd seen the creature, we slowed down and started scanning the area carefully. At first, we didn't see anything unusual. But then Tom called us over to a sandy part of the bank. There in the mud were several enormous footprints, easily twice the size of my own foot. They were oddly shaped, almost like a cross between a human foot and an ape's. We took several photos, our hands shaking with a mix of excitement and lingering fear. As we continued searching the area, we came across more unsettling signs. There were fish carcasses scattered around, half-eaten and torn apart in a way that didn't look like any normal predator. We also found piles of freshwater mussel shells, cracked open with unnatural force. But the most chilling discovery came when Jack spotted something snagged on a low-hanging branch. It was a clump of coarse, reddish-brown hair, exactly like what we'd seen covering the creature. We carefully removed it and placed it in a plastic bag, unsure of what to do with it. As we were preparing to leave, still processing everything we'd found, we heard a twig snap nearby. We all froze, hardly daring to breathe. Then came a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. Without a word, we took off running again, not stopping until we reached the safety of town. Over the next few days, we debated endlessly about what to do. Should we tell our parents, the police, a newspaper? But every time we considered it, we hesitated. Who would believe 3 teenagers claiming to have seen some kind of monster? We'd probably just get in trouble for making up stories or trespassing. We went back to the creek a few more times over the next couple of weeks, but we never saw the creature again. The footprints and other signs gradually disappeared, washed away by rain or obscured by normal wildlife activity. If it weren't for the photos and that strange clump of hair, I might have started to believe I'd imagined the whole thing. It wasn't until about a month later that we heard anything that seemed to corroborate our experience. We overheard some other kids at school talking about a camping trip they'd taken nearby. They described seeing a large, hairy creature crouched near their tent one night. When they shone a flashlight at it, it had run away on 2 legs. Hearing that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't just us. Something really was out there. We never did tell anyone the full story of what we saw that day. But over the years, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings. I've read theories about undiscovered primate species and accounts from all over the country that sound eerily similar to what we experienced. One theory that's always stuck with me is the idea that what we saw might have been a female Sasquatch, possibly even pregnant. It would explain why it was in that specific area. The creek would have provided food and water, and the woods offered shelter. Maybe it was just passing through, looking for a safe place to give birth. To this day, I can't explain exactly what we encountered that summer, but I know what I saw, and I know it was real. That creature, whatever it was flesh and blood, not some figment of our imagination or a man in a costume. The intelligence in its eyes, the raw power of its presence, it was like nothing of this world. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that day. I can hear that unearthly roar and see those wild, knowing eyes staring into mine. But mixed with the fear is a sense of wonder. If something like that could exist without being officially discovered, what else might be out there in the wilderness, just beyond the edge of what we know? I'm sharing this story now because I think it's important for people to keep an open mind about the mysteries of our world. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but I hope it might encourage others who've had similar experiences to speak up. Maybe someday we'll finally uncover the truth about these elusive creatures. Until then, I'll never forget my encounter on that summer day by Kickapoo Creek, when I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably does. Story 17. I'll never forget that day in August 1970. It was supposed to be just another hiking trip in the North Cascades, but what I saw out there in Boston Basin changed my life forever. I'd driven up from Seattle early that morning, eager to spend a day exploring the alpine meadows. The weather was perfect, clear blue skies and temperatures in the mid-70s. As I made my way up the trail, I felt at peace, surrounded by the rugged mountain scenery. Little did I know the terror that awaited me. It was early afternoon when I reached a beautiful meadow dotted with wildflowers. A small stream meandered through, its gentle burbling the only sound apart from birdsong and the breeze rustling through the grass. I decided it was the perfect spot for a lunch break, so I found a comfortable rock to sit on and pulled out my sandwich. As I ate, I gazed contentedly at my surroundings, soaking in the pristine wilderness. That's when I saw it. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. About 100 yards away, near the tree line at the far end of the meadow, something large was moving. I blinked hard and looked again. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was seeing. It was unmistakably a massive bipedal creature. But this was no bear. It walked on 2 legs with an eerily human-like gait. My sandwich fell from my trembling hands as I stared in disbelief. The creature was enormous, easily 6 feet tall and bulky, probably 250 pounds or more. But what struck me most was its coloring. Instead of the dark brown or black I would have expected, its shaggy coat was a pale cream color, almost white. It moved slowly through the high grass, seemingly unaware of my presence. As it turned slightly, I could see its profile more clearly. My jaw dropped as I noticed its distinctly protruding belly. Could this thing be pregnant? The thought made me feel dizzy. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15-20 seconds, I sat frozen, afraid to move a muscle. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure the creature would hear it. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. What was this thing? How could it exist without anyone knowing? Was I hallucinating? Just then, the creature's head snapped in my direction. I caught a glimpse of a flat, ape-like face before it suddenly bolted with surprising speed. In a flash, it had vanished into the thick forest at the meadow's edge. I sat there for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. My hands shook as I fumbled for my water bottle, suddenly parched. Part of me wanted to approach the spot where I'd seen the creature, to look for tracks or other evidence. But a primal fear kept me rooted in place. What if it came back? Eventually, I managed to gather my wits enough to pack up my gear. I practically ran back down the trail, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made me jump. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, utterly exhausted. The drive back to Seattle was a blur. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, questioning my sanity. Had it really happened? That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale, lumbering form. I became obsessed with researching similar sightings, poring over books and newspaper clippings about Bigfoot and Sasquatch encounters. But nothing I read quite matched what I'd seen. The size and behavior were similar to other reports, but the coloring was all wrong. And that swollen abdomen, could there really be a breeding population of these creatures out there? In the days and weeks that followed, I debated whether to report my sighting. I knew how crazy it would sound. Who would believe me? I had no proof, no photos or physical evidence, just the vivid memory seared into my brain. I did eventually work up the courage to tell a few close friends. Their reactions ranged from fascination to skepticism to outright mockery. One suggested I'd simply seen a bear standing on its hind legs. Another theorized I'd eaten some hallucinogenic mushrooms by mistake. But I know what I saw. That creature was no bear, and I certainly wasn't hallucinating. The encounter was all too real, and it haunts me to this day. I've returned to Boston Basin several times over the years, hoping for another glimpse. But I've never seen anything out of the ordinary there again. It's as if that creature materialized out of thin air for those brief moments, then vanished back into myth and legend. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something large moving in the woods while driving on a lonely mountain road. Or I'll hear an unusual sound while camping that sends chills down my spine. And I know in my bones that there are things out there we can't explain. I'm an old man now, and I've never publicly shared my story until today. I've carried this secret for over 50 years, afraid of being labeled a kook or attention seeker. But as I near the end of my life, I feel compelled to finally speak out. People deserve to know the truth about what's lurking in our wilderness. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but I hope my account might offer some validation to others who've had similar encounters and felt too afraid to come forward. To this day, I can close my eyes and see every detail of that creature with perfect clarity. Its loping gait, its massive furry form, that swollen belly. The memory is as fresh as if it happened yesterday. I don't know if it was a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or something else entirely. I can't explain how such a large animal could remain hidden from science. But I know what I saw that day was real. And I'll go to my grave believing that there are mysteries in this world far beyond our current understanding. So the next time you're out hiking in the mountains, keep your eyes and ears open. You never know what might be watching you from just beyond the trees. There are things out there that defy explanation. I've seen them with my own eyes. Story 18. The road was empty, just a long stretch of darkness broken up by my headlights. I was focused on the drive, but my mind was wandering a bit, thinking about what I'd have for a late dinner when I got home. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, this massive dark shape lurched onto the road right in front of the bus. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, my heart leaping into my throat. The bus screeched and fishtailed as I fought to keep control. Some of the kids screamed, jolted awake by the sudden movement. For a split second, my headlights illuminated the thing in the road. It was huge, way bigger than a person, but it wasn't a moose or a bear. The proportions were all wrong, and its hair, it had this long, shaggy hair that was almost blonde, hanging down to its shoulders. I've never seen anything like it before or since. As quickly as it appeared, the creature bounded across the road and disappeared into the woods on the other side. The whole thing probably only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like time slowed down. I managed to get the bus under control and pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking on the wheel. "Is everyone okay?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a chorus of confused and frightened responses. I did a quick head count. Miraculously, no one seemed hurt, just shaken up. That's when Larry, one of the older kids who'd been sitting up front, spoke up. "Ms. Luttrell, what was that thing? Did you see it?" I hesitated, not sure what to say. I'm not sure, Larry. It happened so fast." But Larry pressed on, his voice trembling slightly. "It wasn't a bear, was it? It looked wrong, like something between a bear and I don't know what." I felt a chill run down my spine. So I hadn't imagined it. Larry had seen it too. "I don't know what it was," I admitted, "but we're all safe now. That's what matters." I tried to reassure the kids as best I could, but inside I was rattled to my core. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The size of it, the way it moved, that strange hair. It defied explanation. After making sure everyone was truly all right and calming them down as much as possible, I cautiously pulled back onto the road. My nerves were shot, and every shadow in the trees made me flinch. I drove well below the speed limit the rest of the way to Cobalt, my eyes darting constantly between the road and the dark forest on either side. When we finally reached town and I dropped the last of the kids off, I let out a long, shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I wanted nothing more than to go home and try to forget the whole thing. But I knew I had to report the incident. We'd come way too close to a serious accident. I went straight to the bus depot and found my supervisor, Jim, still in his office. He looked up in surprise when I burst in. "Amy, what are you doing back so late? Everything okay?" I sank into the chair across from his desk, suddenly feeling exhausted. "Jim, something happened on the road tonight. Something I can't explain." I told him everything. The creature in the road, the near accident, what Larry and I had seen. To his credit, Jim listened without interrupting, his brow furrowed with concern. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Jesus, Amy, that must have been terrifying. But you did good. You kept those kids safe." "But what was it, Jim?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell did I see out there?" Jim sighed and rubbed his temples. "I don't know, Amy. There've been stories over the years, hunters and loggers seeing strange things in the woods. But nothing like this, nothing so close to town." He looked at me seriously. "We'll file a report, of course. But Amy, you might want to keep this quiet, at least for now. People will talk, and well, you know how rumors can spread in a small town." I nodded, understanding what he meant. The last thing I needed was to be known as the crazy bus driver who saw monsters in the woods. But part of me wanted to shout it from the rooftops to make people understand the danger that might be lurking out there. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to process what had happened. I jumped at every shadow, had trouble sleeping. I kept expecting to see that creature again every time I drove that route, but it never reappeared. Larry sought me out a few times, wanting to talk about what we'd seen. I could tell it was weighing on him too. We compared our memories, trying to make sense of it. But in the end, we were left with more questions than answers. I heard whispers around town of other sightings. A logger who quit his job after seeing something in the woods. A hunter who came back from a trip white as a sheet and refusing to talk about what he'd encountered. But nothing concrete. Nothing that could explain what Larry and I had seen that night. It's been over 50 years now, and I still think about that night often. I've never been able to fully explain or understand what I saw. Was it some kind of undiscovered animal, a creature out of legend, or something else entirely? All I know for certain is that something was out there in those woods. Something big, something strange, something that didn't belong. And the thought that it might still be out there, that other unsuspecting people might encounter it, well, that still keeps me up at night sometimes. I've never spoken publicly about what happened before, but I feel like I need to share this story now to warn others. If you're ever driving those lonely roads at night, keep your eyes open. And if you see something that doesn't look quite right, don't stop. Just keep driving and pray it doesn't decide to follow you home. Story 19. I was just a young guy back in August 1970, fresh out of college and eager for adventure. My buddy Richard and I decided to take his sister Sharon on a camping trip up to Trinity National Forest in Northern California. We'd heard it was beautiful country, full of towering redwoods and pristine wilderness. Little did we know what kind of wilderness we'd encounter up there. We arrived at Gulch Basin late on a Friday afternoon and set up our campsite near a small creek. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine. As the sun started to set, we got a fire going and cooked up some hot dogs for dinner. Richard cracked open a few beers, and we sat around swapping stories and laughing. It felt great to be out in nature, away from the craziness of the world. But as night fell, things started to feel off. The forest got eerily quiet. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, just dead silence. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just being in an unfamiliar place. We turned in around 11 p.m., crawling into our tents. I woke with a start around 2 a.m. At first I wasn't sure what had roused me. Then I heard it, heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush, circling our campsite. My heart started racing. I strained my ears, trying to make out what it could be. Too heavy for a deer or bear. It sounded almost human, but much bigger. I unzipped my tent as quietly as possible and peeked out. The fire had died down to embers, casting eerie shadows. That's when I saw it, a massive dark shape moving at the edge of our camp, at least 8 feet tall. I froze, not daring to breathe. It turned and I caught a glimpse of red eyes reflecting the firelight. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. When I looked again, it was gone. I lay awake the rest of the night, jumping at every little sound. When dawn finally broke, I stumbled out of my tent, bleary-eyed and on edge. Richard and Sharon were already up, looking as rough as I felt. "Did you guys hear anything weird last night?" I asked hesitantly. They exchanged a look. "You mean the footsteps?" Richard said. "Yeah, we heard 'em too. Thought I was going crazy." We decided to hike up to a ridge about a mile from camp, hoping the exercise and fresh air would clear our heads. As we climbed, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. We had just reached the top when we heard a crash in the brush below. Before we could react, A rock the size of a grapefruit came sailing through the air, landing with a thud about 10 feet from us. My blood ran cold as I realized. That was a warning shot. "Let's get out of here," Sharon whispered urgently. We scrambled back down the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. Back at camp, we tried to go about our day normally, but the atmosphere was tense. We kept seeing movement out of the corners of our eyes, dark shapes ducking behind trees. I suggested we pack up and leave, but Richard was determined to stick it out. "It's probably just a bear," he said, not sounding convinced. As night fell again, none of us wanted to split up into our tents. We stayed huddled around the fire, speaking in hushed tones. Around midnight, we heard heavy footsteps approaching again. Sharon let out a small whimper of fear. Suddenly, our battery-powered radio crackled to life, even though it had been off. Staticky music drifted out, cutting in and out. We stared at each other in shock. Then, to our horror, a massive hand reached out of the darkness and picked up the radio. I caught a glimpse of thick, matted hair covering the arm before it withdrew into the shadows. We spent another sleepless night, huddled together in Richard's tent. At first light, we hastily packed up camp. As we loaded the car, I noticed strange prints in the mud near the creek. Huge footprints, easily 18 inches long. I counted 9 clear prints before they disappeared into the brush. On our drive out, we came across a disturbing sight. Half a deer carcass strung up in a tree about 12 feet off the ground. It looked like it had been torn apart by incredibly strong hands. My stomach churned as I imagined what kind of creature could do that. We made it home safely, but I still have nightmares about those red eyes gleaming in the dark. I've tried to rationalize what we saw. Maybe it was just bears. Maybe our minds were playing tricks on us. But deep down, I know we encountered something that science can't explain. I've never been camping since. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I hear those heavy footsteps circling my house. I don't know what those creatures were, but I know they're out there, waiting in the depths of the forest. And I hope to God I never cross paths with them again. Story 20. I had been riding for about an hour, just enjoying the solitude and the purr of my bike's engine, when I started to get an uneasy feeling. You know that prickle on the back of your neck, like you're being watched? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just getting spooked because it was getting dark. But the feeling wouldn't go away. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, I caught a glimpse of movement in the thick brush off to the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes, but then I saw it clearly, a massive dark shape lurking just inside the tree line. I'm talking huge, way bigger than any bear or elk. This thing had to be 10-12 feet tall at least. My heart started racing, and I slowed the bike down, straining to get a better look. That's when I saw its arms. They were unbelievably long, reaching out from its body like tree branches. But the thing that really made my blood run cold was its hands. In the fading daylight, I could see its palms clearly. They were a pale, almost white color that stood out starkly against the dark fur covering the rest of its body. Those hands looked eerily human-like, but massive. Each one was probably as big as my entire torso. I knew I should gun the engine and get out of there fast, but I was frozen in place, unable to look away from this terrifying creature. It seemed to be observing me just as intently as I was looking at it. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard in my life. It started as a low, guttural growl and rose to a piercing shriek that echoed off the mountains. I swear I could feel it vibrating in my chest. That scream jolted me out of my paralysis, and I twisted the throttle as hard as I could, taking off down the road at a speed that was probably way too fast for those twisting mountain curves. I didn't slow down until I had put several miles between me and that thing. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep hold of the handlebars. I kept glancing in my mirrors, terrified I'd see it chasing after me. But there was nothing there except the darkening road behind me. When I finally made it back to town, I was a mess. I went straight home and locked all the doors and windows, even though I knew that wouldn't do much good if that creature decided to come looking for me. I didn't sleep a wink that night, just sat up with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. The next day, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was more tired than I realized, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I knew deep down that wasn't true. What I had seen was real, and it haunted me. I debated whether or not to tell anyone about what happened. On one hand, I desperately wanted someone to believe me, to validate that I wasn't going crazy. But on the other hand, I was afraid people would think I was nuts if I started talking about giant hairy monsters in the woods. In the end, I decided to confide in my best friend, Jack. We'd known each other since we were kids, and if anyone would hear me out without judgment, it would be him. I invited him over for beers and tried to casually bring up the subject. "Hey, Jack, you ever hear any weird stories about creatures living up in the Blue Mountains?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He gave me a strange look. "What, like bears and cougars? Sure, there's plenty of wildlife up there." I took a deep breath. "No, I mean like really big creatures, like impossibly big." Jack's eyebrows shot up. "Rich, what are you talking about? You see something weird on your ride last night?" I couldn't hold it in anymore. The whole story came pouring out. The feeling of being watched, the massive shape in the woods, those pale hands, and that bone-chilling scream. Jack listened without interrupting, his expression growing more concerned with each detail I shared. When I finished, there was a long silence. I braced myself for him to laugh it off, or tell me I was imagining things. But he didn't. "Jesus, Rich," he said finally. "That's intense. I've never heard anything like that before. You really saw all that?" I nodded, relief washing over me that he wasn't immediately dismissing my story. "I know how it sounds, Jack, but I swear to God it was real. I've never been so scared in my life." Jack leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I believe you saw something, man. You don't make shit up, and I've never seen you this shaken before. But what the hell could it have been?" We spent the next few hours speculating. Could it have been some kind of undiscovered species, a genetic mutation, something not of this world? None of the explanations we came up with seemed to fit. In the end, we were left with more questions than answers. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I found myself obsessively researching cryptozoology and local legends, looking for anything that might explain my encounter. I even went back up to that spot in the mountains a few times during the day, hoping to find some kind of evidence, footprints, hair, anything. But there was nothing. As time passed, the memory of that night began to feel almost dreamlike. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Or had my mind somehow conjured up this terrifying image? But every time I started to doubt myself, I would remember that scream, and the absolute certainty I felt in that moment that I was in the presence of something beyond my understanding. I never saw the creature again, despite spending countless hours in those mountains over the years. But I never forgot it either. To this day, I can't hear an unusual sound in the woods or see an oddly shaped shadow without my heart rate spiking. I'm an old man now, and I've had a good life. But that encounter in the Blue Mountains has always stayed with me, a constant reminder that there are things in this world that we can't explain. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe I never will. But I know it was real, and it changed me forever. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has ever seen it. If there are other people out there carrying around similar memories, too afraid or unsure to speak up. I hope that by sharing my story, maybe someone else will find the courage to come forward with theirs. Because whatever that creature was, I'm certain it's still out there, somewhere in those mountains, waiting to be discovered. Story 21. I was heading back home to Skamania after visiting some friends in Portland. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road. I had the radio on low, just humming along to some tunes to pass the time. Everything seemed normal. Then I heard it, a strange, loud noise coming from somewhere under the hood. My heart sank. Car trouble was the last thing I needed out here. I pulled over onto the shoulder, cursing my luck. The engine was making an awful racket. I got out to take a look, popping the hood and peering inside. But I couldn't see anything obviously wrong. As I stood there puzzling over it, the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood up. I had the overwhelming feeling I was being watched. Slowly, I turned around, and there it was. My blood ran cold. Standing not 20 feet away was the biggest, most terrifying creature I'd ever seen. It had to be at least 10 feet tall, maybe 12, covered in thick, shaggy brown fur. But it wasn't a bear. This thing was standing upright on 2 legs. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I just stood there, staring. Its face, God, I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It had a wide, flat nose and a heavy brow, but the eyes, those glowing amber eyes, they seemed almost human, intelligent. They bored right into me. The mouth was open slightly, revealing huge square teeth. There was something dark smeared around its lips and chin. With horror, I realized it had been eating something. I prayed it wasn't human. We just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I could hear its heavy breathing, see its massive chest rising and falling. A low rumbling sound came from deep in its throat. My legs were shaking so bad I thought I might collapse. I wanted desperately to get back in my car, but I was terrified any sudden movement would provoke it to attack. So I remained frozen in place, hardly daring to blink. The creature tilted its head slightly as if studying me. Then it took a lumbering step forward. I let out an involuntary whimper of fear. It paused, regarding me curiously. Then, to my utter shock, it raised one enormous hand and waved it back and forth, almost like it was gesturing, "Hello." I must have blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car with the doors locked, hyperventilating. I have no memory of how I got there. When I finally got the courage to look out the window again, the creature was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there at all. With trembling hands, I started the engine. To my amazement, whatever noise I'd heard earlier was now gone. The car purred to life like normal. I slammed it into drive and tore out of there as fast as I could. I drove straight home without stopping, my heart pounding the whole way. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, terrified I'd see that thing following me. But there was nothing. When I finally got home, I collapsed into bed and didn't leave the house for 3 days. I was too shaken to even tell anyone what had happened at first. Who would believe me anyway? It took me weeks to work up the courage to drive that stretch of highway again. Even now, years later, I get chills thinking about it. I've tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, or maybe I dozed off at the wheel and had some vivid waking dream. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. That creature was no bear, no man in a costume. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist, but does. The truly unnerving part. This wasn't even my first encounter. 2 years earlier, I'd seen a similar creature in the woods near my home. I'd managed to mostly forget about that incident, to write it off as a trick of the light or an overactive imagination. But after this second, much closer encounter, I can no longer deny the truth. These things are out there, watching, waiting. I don't know what they want or where they come from, but I know they're real. And that knowledge haunts me to this day. I still drive that highway sometimes. I can't avoid it entirely, but I never stop there anymore, no matter what. And I'm always watching the tree line, half expecting to see that massive fur-covered shape emerge from the shadows. Sometimes at night I wake up in a cold sweat, those glowing amber eyes vivid in my mind. I try to tell myself it was just a dream, but then I remember it wasn't. It was all too real. I've never told many people about what happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, and I know there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. So if you're ever driving down a lonely stretch of road as the sun starts to set, and you get that prickly feeling on the back of your neck like you're being watched, don't stop. Don't get out of your car. Just keep driving, because you never know what might be out there in the shadows, watching and waiting. I still don't understand why it waved at me that day. Was it trying to communicate? Or was it just mimicking human behavior it had observed? The thought that these creatures might be intelligent enough for that is almost more terrifying than if they were simply animals. There are times I've been tempted to go back, to try and find evidence of what I saw. But the fear always holds me back. What if I actually found something? What would I do then? And worse, what if it found me again? So I keep my story to myself, for the most part. But I know what I saw, and I know they're out there, somewhere in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, waiting, watching. I just hope I never see one again. Story 22. As the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the pasture, I heard what sounded like gunshots in the distance. It wasn't entirely unusual to hear hunting or target practice around those parts, but something about the sound put me on edge. The shots seemed erratic and closer than normal. I told my husband I was going to walk over and check it out, make sure no one was trespassing or poaching on our land. He was hesitant, but I assured him I'd be fine. I knew these fields like the back of my hand and always carried a flashlight. Looking back now, I wish I had listened to his concerns. As I made my way across the pasture towards the tree line where I thought the shots had come from, an eerie stillness settled over everything. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves seemed muted somehow. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. I came to the old barbed wire fence that marked the edge of our property. The fence was about chest high on me, and I had climbed over it hundreds of times before. As I started to duck under the top wire, I heard a twig snap loudly behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. In the fading twilight stood a massive, hulking figure covered in dark fur. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. For a split second, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a bear standing on its hind legs? But no, the proportions were all wrong. This thing was clearly bipedal, with long arms that hung down past its knees. Its eyes caught what little light was left, glowing an eerie reddish color as it stared right at me. The stench hit me then, a horrific combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something musky and wild. I gagged involuntarily, frozen in terror. Before I could even think about screaming or running, the creature lunged forward with shocking speed. Massive hands grabbed me around the waist, engulfing me completely. I felt myself being lifted off the ground as easily as if I were a rag doll. The world spun crazily for a moment, and then I was flying through the air. I crashed back down on the other side of the fence, the wind knocked out of me as I hit the ground hard. Gasping for breath, I scrambled backwards, expecting the monster to come tearing through the fence after me. But when I looked up, It was gone, vanished into thin air, as if it had never been there at all. The only evidence of the encounter was my own bruised body and racing heart. I don't know how long I sat there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I heard my husband calling for me in the distance. His voice snapped me back to reality, and I stumbled to my feet, running towards the sound of his voice as fast as my shaking legs could carry me. When I reached him and tried to explain what happened, the words tumbled out in a barely coherent mess. I was crying and trembling uncontrollably. He clearly thought I had fallen and hit my head or something. There was no way he could believe what I was telling him. We went back to the spot with flashlights, but found no tracks or other signs of the creature. Just some trampled grass where I had landed. My husband was convinced I must have spooked a bear or mountain lion and exaggerated the experience in my panic. But I know what I saw. That thing was no normal animal. The intelligence in its eyes, the way it moved on two legs, how easily it threw me. It was something else entirely. For years afterwards, I had terrible nightmares about glowing red eyes and the sensation of being helplessly lifted into the air. I've never told many people about what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I know the truth. There are things out there in the woods that defy explanation. I count myself lucky that whatever it was chose to simply toss me aside rather than tear me apart. To this day, I can't stand the smell of wet dog without feeling a rush of panic. I avoid going near that back pasture, especially at night. My husband eventually came to accept that something truly terrifying must have happened to affect me so deeply, even if he can't bring himself to believe in monsters. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else in the area has seen similar things over the years, but it's not exactly the kind of topic you bring up in casual conversation, so I've kept it to myself, trying to move on with my life and forget. But on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can still hear something large moving through the trees at the edge of our property, and I know that whatever I encountered that night is still out there somewhere, waiting in the shadows. I don't know if it was what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch or some other unknown creature. All I know is that it was real, it was terrifying, and it changed my life forever. I'll never forget those glowing eyes or massive fur-covered hands. The image is seared into my memory. Sometimes I wonder why it didn't kill me. Was it just curious? Did I stumble into its territory and it was simply removing the threat? Or was there some spark of intelligence or empathy that made it decide to let me go? I'll never know for sure. All I can say is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I'm just glad I lived to tell the tale, even if most people will never believe me. But I know what I experienced was real, and I'll carry that knowledge and that fear with me for the rest of my days. Story 23. I was just a teenager back in the summer of 1970, living in the small town of Waynesville, Illinois. It was a quiet place where nothing much ever happened until that August when everything changed. It started on a hot, sticky evening. Me and my two buddies, Jimmy and Tom, decided to head down to Kickapoo Creek to cool off and mess around like we always did. The creek ran through a wooded area on the edge of town, and it was our favorite hangout spot away from prying adult eyes. We were splashing around in the water, trying to catch crawdads, when I heard a weird noise coming from the tree line. It was like a low growl mixed with heavy breathing. At first I thought it was just Jimmy trying to scare us, but when I looked over at him he was frozen in place, staring wide-eyed at something behind me. I slowly turned around, and that's when I saw it. Standing there at the edge of the trees was, well, I don't even know how to describe it. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But the strangest thing was that it was standing upright on 2 legs, almost like a person, except it definitely wasn't a person. Its face, God, I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It had these deep-set eyes that seemed to glow slightly in the dim light, a wide, flat nose and a mouth full of sharp teeth. It was like some nightmarish combination of an ape and a bear, but way bigger than either. For a few seconds, we all just stared at each other in shock. Then Tom let out this high-pitched scream, and the thing lunged forward, surprisingly fast for its size. We scrambled out of the creek and ran as fast as we could back towards town, our bare feet slapping against the dusty path. I could hear heavy footsteps and crashing sounds behind us, like it was chasing us through the underbrush. But I didn't dare look back. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town, gasping for breath. When we finally felt safe enough to stop, we tried to process what we'd just seen. Jimmy was shaking, and Tom looked like he was about to puke. I felt like I was in some kind of dream or nightmare. We agreed to tell our parents, figuring they'd know what to do, but of course they didn't believe us. They said we must have seen a bear, or that our imaginations were running wild. The local sheriff just laughed it off when we reported it. It was beyond frustrating. We knew what we saw wasn't any normal animal. For the next few days, we were too scared to go back to the creek. But eventually, curiosity got the better of us. We started asking around town if anyone else had seen anything strange. Most people brushed us off, but a couple of the older folks got a weird look in their eyes, like they knew something but didn't want to talk about it. Then, about a week later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't us kids, but some respected members of the community. Steve Rich, George Taylor and Monty Schaefer were out checking fences on the Taylor farm when they spotted something in the back pasture. They described almost the exact same thing we'd seen, a huge, hair-covered creature walking on two legs. They said it was at least 400 pounds and moved with an odd, loping gait. When it saw them, it let out a bone-chilling roar and disappeared into the woods bordering the property. This time, people started to take notice. It was one thing for some teenage boys to claim they saw a monster, but these were grown men with a solid reputation. The local paper even ran a small story about it, calling it the Waynesville Beast. Things really ramped up a few days later when two construction workers had their own encounter. Dan Lindsay and Mike Anderson were working on expanding the highway that ran along Kickapoo Creek. They were operating some heavy machinery when Mike spotted something moving in the trees nearby. At first, he thought it was just a deer or something, but then this massive brown figure emerged, walking upright. Dan estimated it was over 6 feet tall. They said it moved with surprising grace for its size, almost gliding between the trees. The two men were frozen in shock. Mike said later that he felt like his brain just couldn't process what he was seeing. It was so outside the realm of anything he'd encountered before. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing and seemed to study them for a moment. Dan said he felt like it was sizing them up, deciding if they were a threat. Then it let out a low, rumbling growl that they could feel vibrating in their chests. That snapped them out of their daze. They both scrambled to get back in their truck, fumbling with the keys in panic. As they peeled out of there, Dan looked in the rearview mirror and swears he saw the thing pick up a huge log and hurl it in their direction with incredible strength. By this point, the whole town was buzzing with the stories. Some people were scared, refusing to go into the woods or let their kids play outside. Others were excited, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature themselves. A few enterprising locals even started selling T-shirts with a cartoon Bigfoot on them. The sheriff finally had to take it seriously and organized a search party to comb the woods around the creek. They didn't find the creature, but they did discover some strange tracks and tufts of coarse hair caught on tree branches. It was sent off to be analyzed, but the results were inconclusive. As for me and my friends, we became minor celebrities at school. Everyone wanted to hear our story firsthand. Some kids thought we were so cool for seeing it, while others teased us and called us liars. I started to wish we'd never said anything. The sightings continued sporadically over the next few weeks. A woman taking out her trash late at night said she saw a massive shadow move across her yard. A trucker passing through town claimed something huge darted in front of his rig on the highway. Each new encounter added to the tension in town. People were scared, but also fascinated. There was talk of calling in experts or setting up camera traps to try and catch the thing on film, but nothing ever came of it. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sightings stopped. Weeks went by with no new reports. People slowly began to relax and go back to their normal routines. Some said the creature must have moved on to a new area. Others suggested it had all been an elaborate hoax or mass hysteria. But those of us who saw it up close knew the truth. Whatever that thing was, it had been real. And even though the encounters stopped, the memory of that terrifying creature lingered. Even now, over 50 years later, I still get chills thinking about that summer. Sometimes when I'm driving past Kickapoo Creek at night, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that hulking figure emerge from the shadows. I don't know what it was or where it came from. Maybe it was some unknown species or a genetic mutation. Hell, maybe it really was Bigfoot. All I know is that it was unlike anything I've ever seen before or since. The incident changed our little town forever. Even though life went back to normal on the surface, there was always an underlying current of unease. People became more wary of the woods. Parents were more protective of their kids. And those of us who encountered the creature firsthand were never quite the same. It shook our understanding of the world and what was possible. How could something like that exist without anyone knowing about it? What else might be out there that we don't know about? I've spent countless hours over the years trying to make sense of what happened that summer. I've read every book I could find on cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. I've reached out to others who've had similar encounters in other parts of the country, but in the end, I'm left with more questions than answers. All I know for certain is what I saw with my own eyes. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the day I came face to face with the Waynesville Beast. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, roaming the forests and staying just out of sight. Other times, I think maybe it was some kind of shared delusion or mass hysteria. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, half the time I can hardly believe it myself. But I felt compelled to share my story, to get it off my chest after all these years. Whether you think I'm crazy or not, I can say with absolute certainty, something strange happened in Waynesville that summer, and those of us who were there will never forget it. Story 24. Little did I know that in just a few minutes my entire world would be turned upside down. I had lived in Benton my whole life, all 23 years of it. It was a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other. Nothing too exciting ever happened here. That's why what I saw that night shook me to my very core. As I was getting ready to head inside for the night, I heard a rustling sound coming from the cornfield across the road. At first I thought it was just a deer or maybe the neighbor's dog that liked to roam around at night. But then I saw something emerge from the stalks that made my blood run cold. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, if not more, and it was covered in white, shaggy fur from head to toe. For a split second, my brain tried to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear, maybe. But we didn't have white bears around here. And as it stepped fully into the moonlight, I realized with horror that this was no bear. Its body was humanoid, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. It walked on 2 legs, but in a lumbering ape-like gait. The creature's face is what terrified me the most. It had a flat, almost human-like face, but with a protruding jaw full of sharp teeth. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They were a bright, unnatural pink color that seemed to glow in the darkness. I was frozen in fear, unable to move or even breathe. The creature hadn't seen me yet. It seemed to be sniffing the air, its massive head swiveling back and forth. That's when I noticed its hands. They weren't paws or normal hands, but ended in long, curved claws that looked razor-sharp. Suddenly, its pink eyes locked onto me. I felt like a rabbit staring into the eyes of a wolf. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I was paralyzed. The creature let out a low growl that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. Then, in the blink of an eye, it charged toward me. I don't know how, but somehow I managed to snap out of my paralysis and bolt for the front door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the doorknob. I could hear the thundering footsteps of the creature getting closer and closer. Just as I flung the door open and dove inside, I felt a rush of air behind me as massive claws swiped through the space where I had just been standing. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then ran through the house, locking every window and door I could find. My parents weren't home. They had gone into town for a community meeting. I was alone in the house with that thing outside. I grabbed the phone to call for help, but the line was dead. Of course it was. That's just how these things go, right? For the next few hours, I huddled in the living room with all the lights on, clutching my father's old shotgun. I could hear the creature circling the house, occasionally letting out those bone-chilling growls. Sometimes it would scratch at the walls or windows. I was terrified it would break in at any moment. But it never did. As suddenly as it had appeared, the noises stopped. I don't know how long I sat there in silence, afraid to move. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, the creature was gone, without a trace. The next morning I told my parents what happened. They were skeptical at first, but then we found massive, inhuman footprints in the dirt around the house, and long, deep claw marks on the wooden siding of the porch. Over the next few days, I learned that I wasn't the only one who had seen the creature. 14 other people in Benton reported similar sightings. Old Man Johnson said it killed 3 of his cows. The miller's teenage son was hospitalized with claw marks down his back after an encounter. We all got together to compare stories. The descriptions were eerily similar. A massive, white, ape-like creature, pink eyes, long claws. Some estimated it weighed over 300 pounds. A few people managed to snap blurry photos, but they didn't capture the true terror of seeing it in person. The local authorities were baffled. They brought in wildlife experts, but no one could explain what we had seen. Some people said it must have been a mutated bear or gorilla that escaped from a lab or something. Others whispered about government experiments gone wrong. A few of the more religious folks in town said it was a demon sent to punish us for our sins. Whatever it was, it threw our quiet little town into a panic. For weeks, no one went out after dark. Parents wouldn't let their kids play outside. The corn harvest was delayed because farmers were too scared to work in their fields. Gradually, the sightings became less frequent. By mid-September, they had stopped altogether. Life slowly returned to normal in Benton, but things were never quite the same. We all knew that something inexplicable and terrifying had invaded our town that summer. To this day, I still have nightmares about those glowing pink eyes and razor-sharp claws. I've never been able to shake the feeling that the creature is still out there somewhere, waiting. Every time I hear an unexplained noise at night, my heart races as I wonder if it's come back. I know some people probably think I'm crazy, or that I imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw that night, and so do 14 other people in Benton. We don't talk about it much anymore. It's like an unspoken agreement to try to forget. But I know none of us ever truly will. Sometimes I wonder if it will ever return. Part of me hopes it does, just so I can prove to myself that I'm not insane. But a bigger part of me prays that it stays far, far away. Because if it does come back, I'm not sure our town would survive a second encounter with the white monster of Benton. Story 25. I was just a kid back in September 1970, living with my parents in our small cabin outside of Coosby, Oregon. It was a quiet little town nestled in the forest, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing much ever happened. That all changed one crisp autumn evening. I remember it like it was yesterday. The air had that sharp chill that signals the changing of seasons, and the leaves were just starting to turn golden. My dad was out chopping firewood to prepare for the coming winter, and my mom was inside baking an apple pie. The comforting smells of cinnamon and nutmeg wafted through the open kitchen window. It was so normal, so mundane. I had no idea my entire world was about to be turned upside down. I was playing in the backyard, kicking around a soccer ball and pretending to be Pelé after watching the World Cup that summer. Our property backed right up to the edge of the forest, with a steep hill rising up behind us. I always loved exploring those woods, imagining all kinds of adventures. But I never ventured too far. My parents were strict about that. The forest can be dangerous, they'd always warn me. If only I'd known how right they were. As the sun started to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, I heard a strange sound coming from the hill. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but there was something different about it. It was deeper, more guttural. I stopped kicking my ball and listened intently, the hairs on the back of my neck starting to prickle. That's when I saw them. Two massive, dark shapes moving through the trees near the top of the hill. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what I was seeing. They were huge, way bigger than any bear or other animal I'd ever encountered in these woods. And they were moving fast, with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for creatures of that size. As they got closer, I could make out more details. The larger one had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered in thick, dark fur that rippled as it ran. The smaller one, though still enormous by human standards, was maybe 6 feet tall. Its fur was similar, but I noticed flashes of silver, especially around its head and legs. They were clearly bipedal, running on 2 legs in a way that was disturbingly human-like. But there was nothing human about their appearance. Their bodies were massively muscular, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. I couldn't make out their faces clearly, but I caught glimpses of dark, intelligent eyes. I stood there frozen, unable to move or even breathe. Part of me wanted to run screaming back to the house, but a deeper instinct told me to stay absolutely still. These creatures were clearly fleeing from something, and I didn't want to draw their attention. As they thundered down the hillside, I realized they were going to pass alarmingly close to where I stood. I could hear their labored breathing now, smell the musky odor of their fur. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Just as they reached the bottom of the hill, maybe 50 yards from me, the smaller one suddenly turned its head and looked right at me. Our eyes locked for a split second that felt like an eternity. I saw intelligence there, and fear, and something else I couldn't quite define. It was like looking into the eyes of a person, but also completely alien. Then, as quickly as it had happened, the moment was over. The 2 creatures veered sharply to the left, disappearing into the thick underbrush at the edge of our property. I heard the crashing of branches for a few more seconds, and then everything was eerily silent. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, I snapped out of my daze and ran back to the house as fast as my legs could carry me. "Dad! Mom!" I yelled as I burst through the back door, nearly knocking over a chair in my haste. "You won't believe what I just saw." My parents rushed into the kitchen, looks of concern on their faces. "What's wrong, honey?" my mom asked, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "Are you hurt?" I struggled to catch my breath, the words tumbling out in a jumbled rush. "There were these things on the hill," huge and covered in fur, running so fast they looked right at me. My dad's brow furrowed. "Slow down, son. What exactly did you see?" I took a deep breath and tried to explain more clearly. I described the size of the creatures, the silver-tipped fur on the smaller one, the way they moved. With each detail, my parents exchanged increasingly worried glances. When I finished, there was a long moment of silence. Finally, my dad spoke. "Are you absolutely sure about what you saw? It wasn't just a couple of bears or something?" I shook my head vehemently. "No way, Dad. These weren't bears. They were running on two legs like people, but they were huge and covered in fur. I've never seen anything like it." My mom put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "It's getting dark out there. Maybe the shadows were playing tricks on your eyes." I felt a surge of frustration. Why didn't they believe me? "I know what I saw," I insisted. "They were real, I swear." My dad sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "All right, son. I believe you saw something that scared you. But let's not jump to any crazy conclusions. There's got to be a rational explanation." He grabbed his rifle from the gun cabinet and headed for the back door. "I'll go take a look around. Make sure there's nothing dangerous out there. You stay inside with your mother." I watched anxiously from the window as my dad walked around the property, shining his flashlight into the growing darkness. After what felt like forever, he came back inside. "Didn't see anything unusual," he reported. "No tracks or broken branches. Whatever it was, it's long gone now." I could tell he was trying to reassure me, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. He didn't really believe me. Neither of them did. That night, I lay awake in bed for hours, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those creatures, their massive fur-covered bodies, the flash of silver, those startlingly intelligent eyes. What were they? Where had they come from? And what were they running from? I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke with a start in the early hours of the morning. For a moment, I couldn't remember why I felt so unsettled. Then it all came rushing back, and I broke out in a cold sweat. I crept to my window and peered out into the pre-dawn gloom, half expecting to see those creatures' eyes glowing in the darkness. But there was nothing there, just the familiar shapes of trees and the distant hoot of an owl. Over the next few days, I tried to convince my parents to believe me. I begged them to call the police, or a scientist, or somebody who could investigate. But they just patted me on the head and told me I had an overactive imagination. "It was probably just a couple of bears," my dad would say. "The light was fading. You were alone. It's easy for the mind to play tricks." But I knew what I'd seen. Those weren't bears. They weren't any animal I'd ever heard of or seen in books. They were something other. I started spending every free moment researching, trying to find any information I could about similar sightings. I pored over books about cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. I wrote letters to scientists and researchers, begging them to come investigate. Most of my letters went unanswered. The few responses I did get were polite dismissals, telling me I must have been mistaken or suggesting I talk to a counselor about my vivid dreams. As the weeks turned into months and then years, I began to doubt myself. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Or was it just the overactive imagination of a lonely kid living on the edge of the wilderness? But every time I started to think maybe I'd made it all up, I'd remember that moment when the smaller creature's eyes met mine. The intelligence I saw there, the connection I felt, that was real. I know it was. Now, all these years later, I still don't have any answers. I've never seen those creatures again, never found any concrete evidence to prove what I witnessed that day. But I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, there are things that defy explanation, things that most people will never see or believe in. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself looking out my window, scanning the darkness. And I wonder, are they still out there? What were they running from? And will I ever see them again? I may never know the truth about what happened that day in September 1970. But one thing's for certain, it changed my life forever. And no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget the day I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist.